Here's what actually happened.
The foundation of all
money. I'm really mad that
what difference does it make, right? What
Stop.
the deregulation of the industry is obviously going to cause more of that industry.
To lubricate the trust connection between people until they have enough.
Yet we could still look at biological reality in determining who's a female, even if there are.
Why don't you denounce feminism the same way you're denouncing capitalism? If you don't...
For something to be objective, it needs to be verifiable. And you can't verify...
If I make a claim as a political pundit, it is true that I definitely could be wrong.
Yeah,
you're promoting, right?
Ideology is the main tenet of politics, right? This is my ideology.
So 2015, anyone go back and watch the footage? The first GOP debate.
Cool, Robert. Oh, that? We're looking for a bar, you said.
And good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. I am Sara, the Raging Tomato, here bringing to you another 1v1 live debate. This evening, I have with me Ivan from Christ is King Philosophy and Eucharist, the democracy defender, making the statement, I apologize, that autocracy is better than democracy for society. Say that 3 times fast. Ivan, would you like to kick us off with your opening statement, please?
Yes, of course. So today we are debating autocracy versus democracy. I will argue that autocracy is the superior form of government, honest, stable across time, spiritually strong, and unifying, while democracy, especially liberal democracy, is built on illusions and short-term thinking. Autocracy is not pure arbitrariness or chaos. It is leadership, personal, accountable, and tied to the fate of the people. An autocrat cannot retire to become a fake consultant for Lockheed Martin. His honor, his family, and his legacy all rise or fall with the fate of the nation. That is true accountability, aiming for eternity in history and beyond. The captain goes down with the ship. Democracy, by contrast, is accountable only to money. Politicians serve donors, lobbyists, and polls. They only care for the next election cycle, not the next generations, because their personal fortunes are never tied to the survival of the nation. They're global citizens of a globalized, corporatized world. They claim they want competition in a marketplace of ideas, but they just want to snuff the competition by claiming theirs is the only method while enriching themselves through insider trading. Autocracy competes without claiming competition is ideal, but seeing competition itself not just as a good in itself, but also potential degeneracy, either by rebellion, destabilization, demoralization, or invasion, which are natural consequences of democratic principles. It doesn't need to pretend that it does not enrich itself, but the expectation is that with great power comes great responsibility, instead of having to hide away the spoils of power as if they were taboo. Democracy promises the rule of law, popular sovereignty, and freedom, but these principles are largely modernist myths. The problem with the myth of the rule of law is that laws exist only on paper, and enforcement depends on people. Judges bend, constitutions fail, and emergencies override rights. The Patriot Act suspended constitutional privacy rights. COVID lockdowns showed us how governments rule. A piece of paper cannot protect citizens from those who make the rules. To believe otherwise leads to deluded political thinking, both at home and abroad. Muddy concepts like human rights are ridiculous if nobody rules the world. The person claiming to be fighting for human rights is actually performatively taking on the rulership of the world for themselves and claiming to speak on behalf of all humanity. This kind of delusion is only possible because of these modernist illusions that obscure politics as it truly is and end up in empty sloganeering and propaganda. Then there's the myth of popular sovereignty. Supposedly the people rule, but elections are bought and tampered with. The media shapes what opinions are acceptable, and lobbying decides outcomes. Democracy is government sold to the highest bidder. Finally, the myth of freedom. Democracy allegedly offers choice, but its choices are shallow illusions. Your options are predetermined by the powerful. The two parties that are bought off by people who don't care about the nation and will sell it out to outside influences. Everything but true leadership in regards to spiritual purpose, identity, or moral order. Liberalism tolerates everything except conviction, challenging its myths and contradictory dogmas. Democracy claims pluralism but enforces a moral orthodoxy. If only democracy is legitimate, then every non-democracy must be reshaped or conquered, like the neocons want. This is not freedom, it's disguised empire. Liberalism leads to globalism. The neoconservatives of our age speak openly about their desires and attempts at toppling foreign governments. They use cries about election interference, while the CIA has interfered with dozens of not just elections, but coups and revolutions abroad. So where's the sense in that? The EU tampered with the Romanian elections because the winner was far right, claiming Russian misinformation, as if successful foreign propaganda would in itself make an election illegitimate. On the contrary, autocracy is honest about power, stable across time, unifying, and spiritually strong, as I said. Autocrats don't pretend power is impersonal. Authority is personal and accountable. Unlike democratic politicians, autocrats cannot cash in on lobbying jobs after they end their so-called service. They must face the consequences of their rule, or at best flee in disgrace. Autocracy preserves culture, identity, and institutions across generations. It rests on giving people a sense of belonging and continuity. And throughout history, autocrats were known to play off the aristocracy and the people in a balancing act to secure this continuity. Democracies dissolve identity into endless debates and short-term politics, sacrificing identity for the benefit of the ruling class while claiming it represents the confused and neglected people, leading to increasing levels of technocratic control for the masses to supplement the lack of true spiritual leadership. Autocracies rest on visions greater than the individual, values, faith, purpose. This is why it's not technocratic in an esoteric sense, but it can let everyone know what the nation is supposed to be doing and how to get on with the program. Autocracy is about sharing in the same spirit. Hierarchy serves that same purpose. Democracy does not have a not-so-secret global vision, but it rests on individual whim. So it cannot inspire duty, sacrifice, or greatness, but selfishness and fragmentation, just like the EU uses the Tower of Babel as a symbol for itself. Democracy should use the image of the Antichrist, a totalizing world system. Autocracy clarifies roles. Rulers owe justice, citizens owe loyalty. Parents should teach their children. There is no shame in being led when you're supposed to follow. Democracy is a proud delusion, a ritualized, systematic regicide meant to fragment leadership and diffuse responsibility into bureaucracy, committees, and elections, which aren't meant to express the citizens' political will, but to co-opt it and defraud it for secret purposes. If you voted, don't complain. If you complain, you should have voted differently. And if you were deceived, that's on you. That's how it robs you of reality itself. Democracies say the citizen is sovereign in order to steal the rightful authority in favor of an idealized and personal one, leading to suburban hellscapes. No one is personally accountable, and societies fracture into endless factions. Everything is endless change into nowhere, where nobody takes accountability for the direction the culture goes in, leading to nihilism, moral relativism, and intersectionality instead of true community. At its core, liberal democracy is a belief system. Authority is impersonal. Truth is to be debated and rationalized. Hierarchy is rejected. But authority is always personal. Courts, parliaments, elections, they all depend on people, not principles. Truth is truth, regardless of anything we rationalize, and hierarchy is natural. My opponent will probably try to lead this debate towards the nature of legitimacy, the nature of authority, and even religious values. If he wants to go there, I will allow him to hang himself and prove everything I claimed in this opening to be true. He says he's a Christian, but Christianity teaches authority comes from God, not crowds. Autocracy acknowledges this. Democracy denies it, eroding legitimacy, virtue, and a nation's identity over time. Without this truly transcendent source of truth, democracy collapses into short-term thinking and flux. It is man's traditions fighting to impose themselves over other tribes, an empire of tribes subjugating each other to have them worship their petty little gods, now in the form of woke causes. So to conclude, autocracy is honest, stable across time, spiritually strong, and unifying. It preserves identity, it inspires greatness, looks towards hierarchy and embodying it, and rests on enduring truth, or at least the claim to transcendent truth, to the pursuit of truth through the expression of a definite identity as an image of divine order. Democracy is a system of illusions. Its rule of law masks power, its sovereignty belongs to financiers and media, and its freedom is a shallow counterfeit. It is a rejection of hierarchy itself, as Umberto Eco said. Liberalism exists to deny there is such a thing as an absolute truth. I support autocracy because it is real people with real needs, responsibility, and vision, not systems that rule. Constitutionalism and parliamentarism, pillars of liberal democracy, are ultimately technocracy in disguise, not representation of the people nor their best interests. Democracy is a system designed by bankers and lawyers to sound virtuous while robbing the people blind. Without a vision, the people perish. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivan. Eucharist, to you, please.
Sure. So I'd like to begin, I guess, by taking on more of a burden than I have to with this question. I want to outline, I think, a brief theoretical case for democracy before turning to what I take to sort of be fatal failings of autocracy. My basic claim tonight is going to be that the lesson we can glean from the history of politics from the ancient world to today is that a limited democracy, that is a government that's controlled ultimately by the people via representation and mediating institutions, rather than rule by the elite few or a single unaccountable autocrat, is both theoretically defensible and practically the most effective at securing peace, stability, and the common good. In contrast, an autocracy, which is a government controlled by a single ruler, small group of ideologically aligned people, which has distinctive features of not having institutional accountability without constraints on their power, is ultimately harmful to individuals, destructive to civil society, and is generally opposed to the common good, tending to rule for the good of the ruler or the ruling group rather than the people. I expect we might end up talking tonight about some criticisms of democracy that come up often that are criticisms of what might be called a pure or direct democracy. References will be made to mob rule, where power is held directly by the people to directly control governance by a 50% plus one majority on all issues. In the sense that people normally use the term, the sense I'll be using in defending it today, I mean a representative democracy. In a letter in 1777 to Gouverneur Morris, Alexander Hamilton put it this way: a representative democracy where the right of election is well secured and regulated, and the exercise of the legislative, executive, and judiciary authorities is vested in select persons, chosen really and not nominally by the people, will, in my opinion, be the most likely to be happy, regular, and durable. So I want to jump back many millennia, right? It's often said that thinkers in the past, like Plato and Aristotle, are great critics of democracy, and while I think it's fair to say people like this have criticisms of what might be called mob rule, the reality is that Plato, Aristotle, and then people after them leading into the American tradition offer some really interesting theoretical cases or conceptual defenses of government of, for, and by the people. So in the Republic, for example, Plato uses Socrates to analyze a decline of regimes from the ideal city, which is a form of aristocracy, which declines into an oligarchy, which is a rule by the rich, which declines into a democracy, which is ruled by the many, which then declines into tyranny. And so cursorily looking at this and saying, you might say, well, democracy is like next to tyranny. This looks pretty bad. But actually, Socrates gives us, I think, some really interesting praises of democracy. He says it's true that democracy allows for mediocrity. It's true that it allows for some of the things my opponent has already complained about, kind of degeneracy and liberty. A person with a democratic soul, he says, flits about from one activity to another with little aim in life, little direction. But the democratic city has one strong advantage, and that's that it makes it beautiful or fine in a sense, like a many-colored coat, because it allows all sorts of people to exist. And for this reason, Socrates says a philosopher probably would choose to live in a democracy, since it's the regime most likely to let him go about pursuing the highest good. So my first claim I'll make with Plato: though democracies do allow some of the negatives that my opponent has mentioned, they also allow the best sorts of people to live in peace and pursue the kind of intellectual activity we're doing here tonight. So let me jump to Aristotle really quickly, right? Aristotle, also a critic of democracy, the thing that he calls literally democracy, ruled by the demos, he says is effectively mob rule. But he also presents an argument for what he calls a politeia, that is, rule by the many for the good of all. And the argument he presents there for rule by the many as opposed to rule by a small number of aristocrats, he makes by analogy. He says, imagine you and your friends want to get together and host a dinner party, right? If one person is responsible for buying all of the food, it's probably going to be a pretty sucky dinner party. But if all all of us pitch in together, we can sort of make up for each other's deficiencies and throw a much better party by combining our resources. And this is the argument he makes for rule by the many. Each individual person in what we would call today a democracy may not be an example of some wonderful aristocrat, some high-minded soul, but together perhaps we can make up or account for each other's differences. So let me drag this now closer to our time. It's often said, for example, in American discourse around the founding of America, that our founding fathers were opposed to democracy. So in what sense is that true? Well, it's true in the sense that they sometimes use the word democracy in a pejorative way, and so in that sense they're certainly critics of it. But I will argue that what they called a republic, which is what I'm sort of defending here, or just as often what they called a representative democracy, is encompassed in our modern use of the word democracy. Liberal democracies around the world make use of limiting features that prevent their democracies from being the kind of mob rule that they so feared. The constituent features of liberal democracy that I'm defending today are regular, free, and fair elections, a separation of powers between executive, legislative, and judicial functions, and the real ability of both of those branches to check each other and the people to check the power of the people who represent them in government. And so historically speaking, I suggest the movement from the rule of God kings to the rule of law, from unaccountable autocrats to limitations on the power of the head of government, such as we see in the developments from the Spartan Senate to the Athenian Assembly to the Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights, has been, I would say, a positive movement. It has secured peace, prosperity, and happiness for innumerable people throughout history. And this system was theorized, defended, and established against an autocratic background through this long process that I'm happy to talk about more today, but I don't want to take up too much time. I'd rather just dive into it. So let me turn really briefly to empirical examples or practical real-world examples that we're living with right now that I think are fatal to anyone's attempt to defend autocracy, as my opponent has tried to do already. There's this organization that's really useful for the study of democratic governments world round. It's called Varieties of Democracy, VDIM. It's a research organization that studies and categorizes governments throughout the world according to various democracy indices. Okay, so these indices measure democracies along different dimensions. Are they electoral democracies? Are they liberal democracies? Are they participatory democracies? Are they deliberative? And so by collecting information about these governments and then categorizing them and coding them effectively, VDIM provides these yearly updates on how various countries score on, for example, free and fair elections with meaningful opposition parties, freedom of the press, and so on, some things that we might be concerned about. Countries that score today, as of this year, as fully fleshed liberal democracies include countries like the United States, Denmark, Japan, Luxembourg, Switzerland, and Belgium. Countries that score as closed autocracies include Kuwait, Turkmenistan, China, Cuba, Myanmar, and my favorite, North Korea. So I would just encourage anybody listening to keep these countries in mind throughout the debate and consider that my opponent, I think, really has to argue either that North Korea, Cuba, and China are better examples of flourishing political communities than the United States, or else maybe argue that real autocracy has never been tried and try to prove to you why his ideal autocracy would solve for all of the problems these real-world examples raise. I'll give you a couple other just factoids, anecdotes about these autocratic civilizations. We find, for example, that autocratic governments have lower life expectancy when we normalize for various factors. We find that famines are more common from the 1800s onwards in countries that code as autocracies. I think the track record of autocracies is quite poor, and while my opponent has presented a quite romantic vision of what they could accomplish, I think he's selling democracy short in its ability to preserve some of the things that I think we both value, and I look forward to the debate.
Perfect. Thank you, Eucharist. I appreciate that. Ladies and gentlemen, as a kind reminder, we're going to get through our debate. We will do closing statements, read and respond to your kind super chats, and then, of course, your favorite part, we will go into open panel dumpster fire. Gentlemen, I leave the floor open to you.
So can you tell me a little bit more about how you're understanding, you mentioned a couple of times that you think autocracies are actually accountable in a way democracies aren't. And this is troubling to me, I guess, because one of the distinctive features of measurable autocracies is the normal mechanisms of accountability that we think of, right? The accountability of like being able to impeach a leader or being able to vote someone out of office is not always available in an autocracy. But you seem to be suggesting a different kind of accountability. So can you flesh that out for me?
Yeah, of course. I think you're giving too much weight to institutions and to pieces of paper instead of people, because what makes a ruler accountable is other people. Rulers they cannot rule alone. So if a ruler is bad enough, he will either be conquered from outside or be usurped from within. In that sense, there is accountability.
So I guess I take this, I sort of agree with you in a sense, and I take that to be an argument in favor of liberal democracy, because when I view an autocracy, right, somebody who, let's say one person or a very small group of ideologically aligned elite are controlling all of the mechanisms of power. Yeah, if they do that badly enough, there may be some pushback, there may be some uprising, there may be some violence, and I think that's what makes autocracies, especially in today, the sort of world we live in, quite fragile and quite bad. I don't know that it increases things like social cohesion when I'm constantly upset with the person who's in power and I can't do anything about it. But okay,
yeah,
so
well,
if you want to respond to that,
yeah, well, that's not the end of it though, because there's also a spiritual element to it. My question is, what gives your system any kind of unity? Because from my perspective, autocracy grants a criteria for what is the common good. You say, well, autocrats, they rule for themselves, but the reality is autocrats get to define what the common good is. They get to define what is important and what is marginal. Your system, it cannot make a difference between what's inside and what's outside. And this is what's happening right now in America. So that's why I say that autocracy gives unity, because it gives the conditions for unity in the first place.
I'm not, so what you just said, again, as a positive of autocracy is part of my argument against it, right? Because you said the autocrat, or the power structure making up the autocrat, gets to decide what the common good is, and you seem to think that that's a basis for unity. I don't quite follow. I think I need more sort of fleshed out evidence there that this one person getting to decide for everyone else what the common good is going to create this unity. If it is a unity, then it seems to me to be a unity either accomplished by force or perhaps grounded on some sort of prior, like maybe ethnic and cultural background that the leader is sort of hyping people up for. So you have autocrats, obviously, who have widespread popular support, but because that person is definitionally deciding what the common good is on their own, that seems to me to be a very fragile situation. I don't know that that's a recipe for long-standing cohesion or unity or anything else that you're talking about.
You mentioned two things. You mentioned force and you mentioned cultural background, having a common heritage. I think it's both. And in case you don't know, like, all democracies are a product of violence as well. Even the US. The US is a product of violence. So what I hear in your words is an implication that somehow violence is inherently evil and that you have to respect the consent of the people somehow. But that's your presumption. You haven't given me a standard for what is a nation, for example. What is a people? Why is there a unity? Why is there a polity? Why is there a society?
Sure. So I think the question of force, I'll agree with you. Force is necessary even in democracies, especially. I'm a huge fan of the American founding period, everything around that, some great historical anecdotes there. And we see very early on the immediate need of the use of force against uprisings and dissension and everything else, the sort of disunity that happened, the calling up of troops, the failure to do that leading to the American Constitution, I think solves for some of those problems. But I think also most people watching this would probably hope that their encounter with explicit violence rather than implicit or the threat of force would be minimized, right? And that's why I think democracies do really well compared to, let's say, an autocracy that sort of has to enforce whatever cohesion the ruler decides is the good cohesion today at the point of a gun in perpetuity. What we would hope in a democracy is that we find other alternatives and avenues to peace. So it seems true, for example, over time that things like trade actually do lead to more meaningful peace than just simply being a sort of chest-thumping autocrat, right?
No.
So these other questions of nation and what provides that unity, I'm happy to get into that. But there's one thing you said earlier, though. You mentioned this a few times, that this is a government of people, not just pieces of paper. And I think that's true. That's important. But again, I am a huge fan of the American founding, and I go and read the Federalist, and these people tried to structure a government that they say explicitly is not supposed to be just a parchment barrier. It can't just be a rule on paper that has to enforce itself. Instead, it's a system. You say I'm leaning too much on institutions. These institutions were designed with insight into human nature in mind to have both internal checks based on self-interest and the power that you're describing, and to have the mechanisms for people to actually come in and stop the government from doing the bad things when we don't like it. And that to me seems far more preferable to the one guy getting to rule it all.
I disagree. I think that you're just like playing the game over and over again. Institutions get fixed with more institutions. So we need more institutions to fix the institutions that haven't instituted enough. I think that's eternal regress. You're presupposing that a system can override human nature. And you also said that in my case, I am imposing through autocracy, and I'm imposing a moral order that isn't fair because it doesn't contemplate, let's say, people's desires. Well, who cares about that? Because I would say that democracy does something even worse than that, which is basically strip you of your metaphysical duty to what is good. Democracy only allows lukewarm positions that do not challenge its status quo. So what I would say is I would rather be killed than be robbed of the possibility of exercising my free will in a meaningful manner. What democracy does is it makes you into a milquetoast person who does not, let's say, face the reality of life and needs to be nestled in institutions to be protected from harsh realities.
So well, first, that latter part of what you're saying just sounds to me like what you're romanticizing or idealizing is a stripping back of politics to a more sort of warlike tribal system for the sake of increasing some sort of human excellence. If we just throw everybody out on the battlefield and make them tougher, that sounds sort of like what, well, if democracy makes us mediocre, then if we made politics a bit more combat-like, wouldn't that make us all better? I'm a little bit unconvinced by that. But you said you're assuming that institutions can override human nature, and I think I'm explicitly not doing that, or at least that's not what the founders were doing or the framers were doing when they're writing the Constitution. They're trying to make institutions that acknowledge and comport with human nature. So when we design an institution, we can either do it in a way that has this like rosy utopian view of human beings and how good they can be, and wouldn't it just be awesome if they could just run it right, if we just had the best person in power, which, by the way, I think is the mistake that autocrats make. Instead, we could design a system that takes account of the fact that these people are kind of nasty, self-interested people who want to aggrandize power to themselves, and we can structure those institutions in a way to where those interests of self-aggrandizement are offset by each other or put at odds with one another, and does create the exact kind of competition you're describing with a healthy outlet through real politics as opposed to war.
No, but war is part of politics and politics is part of war. And I would say that what you're doing is a sleight of hand where you're replacing the spiritual components of a society with fake institutions. You're trying to make a technocracy. You're trying to, let's say, imbibe a spirituality through institutions that cannot be enlivened by its own people. So you're relying on institutions to tell people how to behave amongst each other, but you're lacking the spiritual grounding for them.
It sounds to me like you're suggesting if I just had, one super cool dude in power, that he could just kind of create that spirituality that you're describing. No. And I'm not any more optimistic about that than I am or you are about these institutions creating the spirituality. I think that's a thing that can't be coerced, right? That's maybe I'm just a filthy lib in that way, but I don't think the kind of spirit you're describing or spirituality you're describing or care and regard for the highest things you're describing can be inculcated at the point of a gun, either in a liberal democracy or by a guy with a funny mustache at the head of government, right?
So you think that parents should not discipline their children?
No, law is always disciplining and educating, even in a liberal democracy.
Well, then you're doing it at gunpoint.
But always, yeah. A law always has a threat of force behind it. I
don't
have a rosy view of politics that says none of this involves violence, or that this is like a solution to all of our problems. We're not going to have any war or bloodshed or anything.
But you implied a system that does not require violence, or you implied a system that requires less violence. What I'm saying is...
Sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
It doesn't require less violence. I would, from my perspective, it is more violent to give you a wrong frame of reality. To lie to you is more violent than to kill you. Because if I kill you, if there is an afterlife, I haven't done anything to your soul. But if I lie to you, I might deceive you and I might pull you away from the truth and lead you to hell, for example.
Okay, so I do just want to say, like, I think the differences here are clear. I don't think this is a matter of fact disagreement. You did say like you would rather die than be turned into this like weird, squishy, effeminate thing that a liberal democracy would make you. You'd rather just die under a tyranny than have the opportunity to make your compelling case in a format like this so that you might persuade other people to vote for policies and leaders that you prefer. Like it'd be better to die than to be deceived in this way. That's a little bit wild to me.
That's a straw man. That's a straw man.
You said I'd rather die, right? Am I wrong? I don't think that's a straw man. I can go back and listen to it.
No,
I think you said I'd rather die.
The straw man is that under a tyranny you couldn't have any kind of public debate.
Okay, fair enough. I'm not going to say you could not possibly have any kind of public debate. I will say autocracies empirically and theoretically are more likely to restrict your expression in a way that means your ability to publicly debate is minimized and gets pushed into the shadows and the corners.
Yes. And why is that
and
bad?
That creates, in my mind, a kind of dissent and disunity. So that's it.
Why is that bad? Why is that bad?
Why is it bad? Hold on.
My freedom of speech.
No, hold on. Hold on. You brought that up. I'm saying. Hold on. I'm trying to follow the chain that we just got here. I don't understand where we got off the rails.
Probably along the lines of because you were talking about the idea that not freedom of speech, but more along the lines of it, like having the ability to make the call outs. You're losing that ability to make the call outs as needed, or something. It was something along those lines. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm not defending freedom of speech in the abstract. I hope you've noticed at this point I'm not making any sort of abstract appeals to like the rights of man or anything. I'm not trying to like, give you this like French revolutionary, here's the natural rights I came up with in my bathtub and you've got to follow them kind of thing. I think there are all sorts of reasonable restrictions on speech and expression that we can talk about that again also are compatible with liberal democracies. It's just what you've suggested to me is it's not that I'm saying democracy doesn't require violence. I'm saying that politics, properly speaking, is an alternative to the worst kinds of violence, which lets us resolve some of our conflicts in nonviolent ways when we can. And this is like at the heart of the political turn that you get with Plato and Aristotle, is why I love them so much, is that they are looking at a world that is fundamentally about what can I do with like my fists and my strength of arms? What about me is like beautiful and external? And they're saying, could we not instead have warring reason words instead of like wars on the battlefield where we just kill each other and conquer each other's cities? Is that not a possibility since we're reasoning creatures? Wouldn't that be better if we could accomplish it? I think so.
If we could accomplish that. And the problem is you're taking a lot of Enlightenment ideas that do not really pan out in reality. Speech is a part of cultural war. It is a spiritual war. Debates are not to find who has the best idea. They are to spread ideas. So I'm not trying to convince you, Eucharist. I'm trying to convince the people who are listening to our conversation. I don't have any, let's say, notions that talking things will solve the problems. Talking stuff that, like, there are immovable forces and unstoppable forces and immovable objects. And it comes down to metaphysics and spirituality. And like liberalism is not devoid of its own spirituality, which I think rivals other spiritualities. So it's not that I'd rather have that conversation, but I think that you've arrived to your conclusions by somehow usurping the importance of spirituality and putting it in a lower realm just because you want to avoid physical conflict. And in that sense, I think you're making an idol out of peace because you're fundamentally pursuing a peace that is based on philosophical incongruency. And that peace will not last, even if you wanted to. So in order to keep that peace, you start giving more concessions to the point that you don't have any identity anymore. And what you were saying about, let's say, autocrats not being able to, let's say, invent a spirituality. Well, the reality is that autocrats are already playing on a spiritual field. So if you think of, I don't know, different systems of legitimacy and different religions, autocrats, they always had a different claim to power, authority, and legitimacy. For example, in Orthodoxy, monarchs derive their authority from the church. They have to recognize the church. In other societies, monarchs could be god kings, god emperors. In other societies, it was pure power. In other societies, I don't know, it was a turn for this god to rule, then another god will rule, etc., etc. What I'm saying is, you're presupposing a system that is superior to any other system simply because it, quote unquote, is less violent. And why should violence be the measuring stick?
So I love it when people make my points for me. You've just listed a bunch of things. And again, I think these are fundamental disagreements. And so these aren't disagreements at this point, I don't think, on matters of fact. These are things that the audience is going to have to parse out. You've said you're not trying to persuade me. All right, I'll take your word. You're not trying to persuade me. So you've just said autocrats are already playing on a spiritual field. And you've just listed 3 or 4 things by which they could derive their power. Maybe the divine right of kings. Maybe they could be god kings, literally descended from the gods, or given that status in a sort of divine way. Or maybe they just rule by pure power. Okay, fine. If that's the position you're defending, that's great. It's on the table. I have criticisms of each of those things. One of these I want to hone in on, right? One of your points that you brought up is the myth of popular sovereignty. And I think these are all fair criticisms of electoral systems, right? You say elections are bought, media manipulates, and lobbyists buy the outcomes. That was the quickest notes I could take. I may not be quoting you exactly, but it's as close as I could get. I just have a question for you, though. When we look at autocracies in the world, for example, in North Korea and Russia right now, do you not think elections are being bought? Do you not think their media isn't manipulating? Do you not think that they're oligarchs and plutocrats are not buying the outcomes of politics and achieving their own ends through this corrupt system? So I'm not sure why autocracy outperforms your criticisms of popular sovereignty in those cases. And if all of this comes back to, well, we've just got a descendant of Heracles on the throne and we're fine with that. Okay, great. You can defend it. That's fine.
It was an internal critique.
Yes, I'm aware. But I'm asking you, is that not also a problem with your position? If it's an internal critique, it's an internal critique back at you, right?
No, because I don't have that issue. Those are not my goals.
So
I'm not beholden to those ideals.
No, just to be clear, though, you're okay with, and you think the autocratic ends you're defending normatively, you're saying this is spiritual, this is good, this is right, is when corrupt elites who hold all of the power buy elections, manipulate people through the media, and buy all the outcomes of the election. You're fine with that as long as it's an autocracy. Yeah,
I'm fine with that so long as that is, let's say, congruent with the spirit of reality. But
okay, great, because I can say I'm not fine with those things, and I would prefer a democracy that gets rid of those things if possible.
Eucharist.
And I think we've made strides to do that as time has gone on.
Are you making my point for me? Are you making my point for me?
You're making my point for me. This is great.
No,
we're making each other's arguments. It's amazing.
What I'm saying is, you have a problem with those things, but my system doesn't.
No, okay, I have a problem with them normatively. I have a problem in the sense that they exist because human nature, as we both acknowledge, kind of sucks. So yeah, I have a problem in the sense that I agree these things happen. They also happen in your system, and I think my system is better at accounting for them.
Yes, but your system spiritually creates those situations while my system does not.
I disagree. So whatever spirituality your God King on the throne is trying to inculcate, the people under him are still going to be nasty, selfish humans who are aggrandizing power and riches to themselves. And we see this in every autocracy throughout history. So I don't think the spiritual cohesion you're talking about changes human nature in the way you see it. Like, you're accusing me of having this rosy view of human nature. It seems like you think if we could just get the awesome God King in the right place, man, wouldn't it just be good? And then, if he does bad things, well, eventually then the people will take up guns and stage a liberal democratic revolution, maybe, right?
No. You see, that's the problem with your argument. You're presupposing that I'm defending autocracy as the be-all, end-all. I see autocracy as simply a more spiritually enlightened way of ruling, not as a perfect system that will guarantee outcomes. You're you're judging autocracy on democracy's standards.
I don't think that's true, because I'm trying to take some things that you said you thought autocracy was good at, which is like longevity, stability, and cohesion. and I'm suggesting that I think autocracies are actually quite bad at those things. So I don't think just judging autocracy by democracy standards. Now, obviously, yeah, because I think democracy is theoretically defensible, I think it's preferable. But I think the things you are saying autocracy does, I'm disagreeing that it does. I don't think it creates this cohesion. I don't think it creates this like thick spirituality. So, for example, right, Viktor Orban in Hungary has done a remarkable job of aggrandizing power to himself. He's restricted freedoms of the press in ways that you might defend, you might object to. But the over time secularization of Hungary is continuing apace, right? The number of people who daily attend church in the state of Massachusetts, one of the most liberal states in the U.S., is higher than the number of people who attend, or weekly rather, is higher than the number of people who attend church weekly in Hungary. So this sort of spiritual drive, this Christian nationalism that he stands on stage and promotes, I don't think is actually accomplishing the things you're saying it does. Yeah.
Yeah, but that is a red herring, because if one autocracy fails, it doesn't mean that the system of autocracy itself is bad. What I'm claiming is that autocracy is a reflection of the people's spirituality. So maybe if paganism is a lie, a pagan king will fail. Maybe if Christianity is true, then a Christian king will rule well. What I'm challenging is the idea itself that democracy somehow is better than autocracy, when it's clearly against itself, it's against its people, it's against its own intellectual history, and it leads to progressivism inevitably. It also doesn't have a unifying principle. Now, you were speaking about institutions, and I would like to say, do you think the Constitution is respected nowadays?
No, I will agree.
Why not?
Why not? I think we've dramatically failed at inculcating a good form of civic education over especially the late half of the 20th century. And I think that's something that some of my best friends are working on fixing now. And I'm optimistic that they have a chance of succeeding.
You see, you have the same problem that you were like accusing.
It's not a problem
Viktor
for me to
Orban
admit
of.
that democracies fail if it's not a problem for you to admit that autocracies fail. I don't see why that's a problem. I can perfectly admit, like I said at the beginning, you listed a bunch of degeneracy and progressivism and this, like all these things that I dislike, right? I can admit that happens in democracies, and I can suggest that within the system of liberal democracy we have means to account for it. This is another thing that so I don't buy. For example, you just said, you used the word inevitability, right? You said liberalism or democracy, liberal democracy both combined, is inevitably leads to progressivism and all these other bad things. You made that similar claim when you said that liberal democracy sort of inevitably tends to globalism. I don't have this deterministic view of politics. I think politics is an exercise. It's the art of the possible, and it's the art of practical and applied wisdom. I don't think these things are necessary. So I can, for example, return to the principles of the American founding, and I can find in quite a few of the American founders, including our God King, the closest we got to it, George Washington, and find strong opposition to globalism, right? So the neoconservatism you're describing is a development, it's a change, it's an intentional rejection of some parts of the American tradition, and I could suggest we could return to that American tradition to oppose it. That's all happening within the liberal democratic framework.
You are not understanding that the liberal democratic framework is already preloaded with a spirituality that already, let's say, undermines itself. Your whole country, its mythology is based on separating from its head. So democracy symbolically is regicide. It's systematic regicide. So it has a progressive telos, a progressive purpose. It says, okay, this principle is never going to be good enough, so we have to change it, and we have to constantly change it. And what I'm saying is autocracy is the only system that can claim to have a connection to tradition and actually have it.
I did. So this, what you just said, like this principle can never be good enough. We have to change and change and change. I don't know that I agree with that phrasing, even within the liberal democratic framework, because it's not that the principle is changing; it's that the application of the principle is changing. Because again, politics is prudential and applied. No, because politics is prudential and applied. So, for example, great. The theorist of conservatism, Edmund Burke, says, a government without the means of some change is without the means of its own preservation. The fact that a government can change and adapt makes it a live thing that can endure and not rot and die. I don't know that, well, okay. the principle is changing in the sense that people no longer adhere to certain principles, I'll agree. I don't know that the principle itself is changing. That's a different claim entirely. So yeah, I mean, if we just want to do an exercise of interpreting the American founding, and we can go through some, I would love to do that. I thrive on that. But I will suggest to you that, so what you see in the imperial crisis, and especially in the 20 years leading up to 1776, are a bunch of people who are fundamentally beholden to their tradition. They're appealing to their rights as Englishmen. They are fundamentally conservative in their impulses, just wanting to be left to do the things that they had been set up to do. And the break happens, they suggest, because of an offensive rupturing action from what you're describing as their head. So I think we can bicker about interpretations of the American Revolution. I don't think it has this sort of inevitable progressive element that you're describing. So.
Yeah, because you're not seeing the philosophical underpinnings of those ideas and how they play out in history. You're talking politics and I'm talking philosophy and theology.
I'm doing both. I promise you I'm doing both.
No, the problem, the problem is that you think there are no entailments. You think there are no entailments to the Enlightenment. You think that there are no entailments to classical liberalism. You're saying they're conservative, but what they're conserving is a revolutionary order.
No, so I'm suggesting that what they're conserving, or what they're bringing about in their science of government, is something that is far older and has much greater heritage than what you're suggesting. You keep slandering me as this Enlightenment thinker. I'm the one over here talking about Plato and Aristotle, right? But so in John Adams' Thoughts on Government, for example, he says one of the things that we can learn very fundamentally from the study of politics throughout time is that there have been actual improvements in the science of politics, that is the practical and applied parts of politics. The thing that does not change, he says, is human nature. So that's important. And he says we can look, for example, to the autocracy of pre-reform Sparta that had kings that were autocrats. They could do whatever they wanted. But the problem, Plutarch tells us in his Life of Lycurgus, is that in such a system, there was this oscillation between democratic revolutions and kings, and democratic revolutions and kings. Stop me if this sounds familiar, if you know anything about the history of Europe, right? So what happened with Lycurgus's reforms was a limitation on the power of the kings, an institution of something like the Senate that was a limiting principle like the one I'm adhering to. And Adams says this is exactly what we're striving for. This is not new. This is not an innovation. We're building on the tradition. So it's very different than what you're describing. I promise you I'm engaging on the philosophy and the theory and the theology as well.
You're recapitulating what I said in my opening statement. I said that you were going to make, let's say, these abstract principles of institutions into let's say, the linchpin of your system. And I'm telling you, when push comes to shove, people with power trample on the Constitution, and your system cannot account to what are the constitutional values, because if you have a system that is always changing, you cannot discern between a change that is in keeping with the original spirit or a change which goes against it. And that's why liberal democracies have never existed for more than 300 years, while autocracies have had thousands of years.
Yeah, the autocracies existing for thousands of years things tends to obscure some pretty fundamental changes that happen within those autocracies. But if we want to smooth it over and just say, hey, look at the Byzantine Empire, it's unchanging in all of its political structures, well, we'll skip over all of that. You keep making comments about institutions that still bug me a little bit. Do you agree, like this is my basic intuition, if you disagree, we can fight it out. Do you think that institutions, as we design them, can have incentives? That is, they will make the people who inhabit those and exercise the powers of those institutions and inhabit the tradition that institution represents, that it can incentivize certain choices over others. It can make certain behaviors more likely or less likely. Do you think that's true at all?
Somewhat.
Okay, so this, I think, is why I'm arguing, again, from the beginning, you've been making my argument. This is a government by people, not by pieces of paper. Correct. And these people, they have institutions. These institutions have levers of power. And if those levers of power are unchecked, that they can use more effectively and more easily for their own self-aggrandizement, they just will. That's just the lesson of human history. So autocracy takes away all of those practical constraints and human nature-based constraints and incentive-based constraints and just says, if they're just spiritual enough, and if they just believe the right stuff, if they're just the right kind of orthodox in the right ethnic background, perhaps this time it will be best. It's never worked before, but darn it, it will this time. And I just don't buy it.
Separation of powers is an Enlightenment ideal that will destroy your country.
Absolutely not. Okay, you are slandering me here. It's absolutely not an Enlightenment ideal.
Are you arguing for autocracy or democracy, man? Let me speak. So what I was saying is, your fixation with separation of powers betrays the fact that you believe that those creators of those institutions had the right anthropology, the right spirituality, and the right structures were created in a perfect manner so that the incentives would always lead to the exact figure that they imagined. Now, I'm challenging that, and I'm saying to you, you have no proof of that. Not only do you not have any proof of that, but the powers themselves, the division of powers, is evaporating. Why? Because your image of what power is a fiction. So that's the argument I'm making, and you're not understanding it. Democracy and separation of powers is a fiction that does not work. The powers will unite once again, for good or for ill, whether you want it or not. And I'm not being fatalistic nor deterministic. I'm simply explaining that politics is different than technocracy. You're saying, no, democracy works because of technocracy. And I'm saying, no, technocracy does not work. You're taking out the subjective and the personal aspect out of these systems, thinking that those systems by themselves already capture human nature perfectly, and they don't. That's why liberalism fails.
Okay, so several things. Okay. You just said you're not being fatalistic or deterministic. That's not true, actually, because you've made several key parts of your argument that there is a sort of inevitable backsliding effect of liberalism that undermines itself and its key claims. I'm very familiar with this argument. I have great sympathies with it. I've read my Patrick Deneen. Okay, I understand the argument, but that is a deterministic argument. It is a fatalistic argument. It suggests that hold on. Hey, hold on. I'm going to talk. It suggests that within liberalism or liberal democracy, there are the seeds to undermining its own sort of self-important goals. I think it has merit. I disagree. I think the liberal tradition has much to commend it that has sort of been forgotten that can be recovered. And that goes to your other point about they thought that they had human nature perfect. Well, no, not exactly. They thought that they had good insight into human nature because you can look at the scope of history. So again, John Adams in his thoughts on government says, it doesn't matter who you look at, whether it's, Augustine, go look at the Calvinists, you go look at, Plato or Aristotle, everybody agrees there's something about self-interest at the bottom of this, that if you give people power, they're going to do some nasty stuff, right? Ring of Gyges and Plato, again, pre-Enlightenment. I'm the only one talking about pre-Enlightenment thinkers here. So when you give people the freedom from fear and the ability to use power however they choose, they will do bad things with it. That's the insight we can gain from human nature. It doesn't assume the thing you also attributed to it, which is that, well, if we just structure the institutions correctly, we'll just have a perfect outcome. They deny this flatly everywhere. This depends on a virtuous people. It depends on people who are selecting good rulers. But you probably know also that some institutions are more apt to be better governed than others. That's why I asked the question about incentives. This is Adam's disagreement with the Alexander Pope quote, where Pope says, for forms of government, fools contest that which is best administered is best. John Adams says that's insane. We know that there are certain types of governments that are more apt to be better administered than others. If you give one guy the keys to the power, you better hope that that's a really, really good guy because that's apt to be badly administered. I will also say, too, that the neo-autocratic arguments that are floated around today and that I think you're imbibing a little bit, especially in your discussion of spiritualism, are far more modernist and Enlightenment focused than I am. They are inheritors of Heidegger and Dugan, who are far more modernist than anything that I'm suggesting from Plato and Aristotle. So I flatly object to the slander of being called somebody who's just shilling for Enlightenment ideas. I think that's
No. That's not my accusation. My accusation is that you're basically saying that a dog cannot behave well, so you have to add two other dog heads and attach them to his body so that he can behave like a good dog. And I'm telling you, you're a monster. You think you're creating a Frankenstein, and you're trying to fix something that isn't broken through those means.
No,
what we need is not to separate power. What we need is for power to reflect the spiritual reality. It's as simple as that. And you're saying, no, but that's impossible. And what you're literally creating the Antichrist. Literally, the book of Revelation is no. I'm being serious. Literally, the book of Revelations is like the bad dragon is like many heads with different crowns. You're introducing many different disparate principles into a body. It's like, okay, I'm going to improve this person by adding a cancer that wants to do something completely different to what the original person wanted to do. It's like, why? Because I mistrust government. Okay, man, be Gnostic if you want. Be fearful. Be fearful of the capacity of power. I'm not fearful of power. I think power should be used.
Okay. I feel like you're making my argument for me. So you've said the autocrats are playing on a spiritual field that gives them either the divine right of kings, God king status, or the exercise of pure power for the enforcement of their legitimacy. You have no problems with power. You're not fearful of it. Again, you said earlier you'd rather die than live in whatever sort of mediocre democracy we've got going on. So yeah, I mean, fine, you can say those things. I like that. But no, the Kerberos analogy is a funny one, and I like it. But no, more what I'm arguing is I would obviously, if I had maybe I'll speak to the crucible part of your audience, Sarah. Pit bulls, right? You guys like talking about pit bulls on the internet. If I had a pit bull, right, I would hire a trainer for it. I wouldn't get a pit bull first, but I would hire a trainer for it. I would want it to be very well trained, but I'm never leaving it alone in a room with my baby, much less a steak, right? I know some things about it that mean I'm going to be skeptical about it, even if I've given it the best possible equipment and instruction and preparation I can. And the same is true for the best people in power. I'm going to assume that no matter the kind of education, no matter how good a person I assume they are, I would rather them have some accountability. And I mean, you keep referencing spirituality and theology and religion. I think this is just as well reflected in the structure of most church governments you would probably consider anything close to legitimate. Yes, you might have an episcopal structure where there's like generally one person sitting at the top, but you also have institutional accountability that stops that person from doing certain things or checks his power in certain ways, right? That's important, whether it's spiritual or whether it's political. And in my mind, it's sometimes, no, I don't want to say it's more important than the spiritual, but when it comes to the person who's going to kill people, if they're doing the things the autocrat doesn't like, yeah, I'd prefer they have some checks on their power, but you're not scared of power. So that's fine. You can say that.
Those checks already exist because you, as a person, have a spiritual insight into what are proper boundaries. So you're not this floating atom in the void who doesn't know when you should push back. It's a matter of fighting, but you're trying to postpone fighting because you don't like fighting. And that's what democracy is. It's a system of cowardice. So in order to prevent wars, because wars are so bad, you have to capitulate on spiritual realities and say, okay, I will give my pinch of incense and I will be part of this Frankenstein monster that's going into every direction at once and which cannot tell me right from wrong simply because I want to live a peaceful life.
Wait, so, I'm sorry, why do you trust the government to tell you you're right from wrong? This is another thing that I find just very strange. Like, I do believe in the educative power of law, but you seem to be, you suggest I'm romanticizing or idolizing liberty. I don't know why, I haven't really made that argument, but I suggest you're romanticizing or idolizing political power as such, as an instrument of teaching people the spiritual cohesion that you're describing, when I just don't think that's what it's for, right?
It is exactly what it's for.
I believe in a distinction between sword and sacrament. So
No, the problem is that you presuppose that you're equal. You presuppose that you're equal to the powerful, and you're not. That's your problem. You're an egalitarian. You're injecting your own egalitarian presumptions onto social structure. So you're making my argument for me. You're basically denying hierarchy, which is literally divine order.
I'm absolutely not doing that.
You being weaker than the tyrant can feel safe. Based on what? Based on paper? Based on a piece of paper? Why?
The implications here.
All the pieces of paper.
The implications you're suggesting are kind of funny to me. Like, this is about cowardice. It's about weakness. It's about not wanting to think that I'm lesser. I'm not an egalitarian, by the way. I believe in a kind of conservative political philosophy that's perfectly comfortable with the moral good of hierarchy. But I am an egalitarian insofar as I believe that we are all created in the image of God and that this has political cash out. Okay, so there are things that matter about hold on, there are things that matter about the fundamental status of dignity between human beings that matter for politics. And so yes, I believe there are such things as what Adams calls natural aristocrats, and this is an institution or a system that is supposed to account for that. So I don't know, I'm not an egalitarian in the way that you're describing. You see, you keep trying to make me into this like Thomas Paine or this French revolutionary. Those are not the arguments I'm making. They're just not.
Democracy is a direct descendant of the French Revolution. The very
democracy predates the French democracy in its limited form, and the form that the founding fathers established it predates literally the French Revolution. We had our revolution first, and we did it quite differently from theirs, right? Because we have the same constitution. They're on what, number 15? Okay, so no, don't make this comparison. It's unfair.
What books were they reading?
They were reading the classics. They were reading Cicero. They were reading Aristotle. They didn't get to Plato until much later.
French Enlightenment thinkers.
A couple of them were. Yeah. Thomas Paine was. And guess what? He almost got beheaded in France. Guess what? Thomas Jefferson was. Thomas Jefferson was an outcast compared to everybody else. Thomas Jefferson wasn't even here for the drafting and ratification of the Constitution. So no, yeah, some of them were. Yeah, some of them were radicals. I'll admit. Oh my goodness, some of the founding fathers were radicals. Not all of them, not most radicals. Of them. No, they were all radicals. Absolutely not.
Yes.
If we want to turn this into an interpretation of the American founding period, I'm happy to do that. I'm more prepared for that than I am for autocracy. So
it's not an interpretation; it's a reality, because the concept of right and left comes after the French Revolution. The conception itself of what you're calling conservative is a post-Enlightenment phenomenon. So what you're calling conservative, for me, is revolutionary.
No, actually, no. I'm hailing from a pretty rich conservative tradition
it's
threads through Plato and Aristotle and Aquinas and Augustine, and these are the people that I'm drawing
from.
So
Plato and Aristotle were liberal Democrats.
I didn't say that. I did say they offer some interesting arguments in favor of what we would now call republicanism or a limited democracy. Yes.
No, Plato was a technocrat.
If we want to argue, if we want to argue about interpretation of Plato, I'm for it. Let's go. But no, he's not actually. That's not true.
What I'm basically saying to you is that all of your ideas about liberal democracy are an Enlightenment product. It's simply as that.
I don't think so. No. So I'll throw another book recommendation at you. Okay, so there's this great, you'll reject it out of hand because it's an Anglican. It's fine. There's this great book called The Desire of the Nations by Oliver O'Donovan. Great political philosopher, great political historian, and he has sympathies that I think would drag him more towards your side than my side, in the sense that he is very sympathetic to what let's call it Christendom, right? This period, especially in the Middle Ages, of the church holding the ruler accountable, as you mentioned a couple of times, right? But that there are developments that directly flow out of Christianity since then, that, by the way, are the inspirations for the modern far right's criticisms of Christianity, because it introduces these egalitarian ideas you're so worked up about. But he draws from this storied tradition from Augustine and Aquinas on, that what you actually get from Christian principles, what you get from the church disciplining the state, is that there are limits on the power of the executive. That flows directly out of Christendom. It's not an Enlightenment phenomenon. You're just wrong. You're just wrong.
Maybe liberalism is the end goal of Christianity. And I would say to you that I'm not here to defend Christianity. I'm here to defend autocracy. So you're trying to pin me to the wall, man. I'm not
trying to pin you to the wall. I'm suggesting that your defense of autocracy is bad. Your accusations that all I'm doing are riffing on Enlightenment ideas is wrong, historically speaking. So that's. I'm not trying to. If you want to toss the Christianity out the window on the way and just defend the autocracy, that's fine. But I think you've already raised all of the primary things that I'm concerned about, right? When I go back and look at the divine right of kings, I think it's both intellectually indefensible and also scary for the implications that it brings. When I read Hobbes, I'm not satisfied, right? So again, I think your ideals are more Hobbesian and Heideggerian than they are anything else. These are not ancient ideas. These are not traditional ideas.
What do you mean they're not ancient ideas? Tradition is an ancient idea.
Jay, no, you have a form of neo-autocracy that is directly riffing on developments from Hobbes into people like Heidegger, into the new right of the 20th century. So yeah.
No, I don't. And you cannot prove that.
Okay. If I'm an Enlightenment shill, you're this shill. I'm just saying it. Yeah.
Well, I can prove that you're an Enlightenment shill because you keep defending a product of the Enlightenment. I'm defending something that is.
So hold on. When I present you with a historical case, just I'm not. You haven't read the book. You don't have to believe it. But when I present you with a historical case that these are not Enlightenment ideals, in fact, they flow out of Christendom. In fact, they are historical heritage of Christian political theology. You say, "Oh, you're just trying to pin me to the wall in Christianity." Right? I'm telling you, historically speaking, I can give you the case from Plato on of where I'm building this. It's not just this distinctively Enlightenment phenomenon. And in fact, I'm rejecting what you're calling the Enlightenment parts. You're leaning on the French parts and trying to impute that to me. And I'm saying those people are crazy. And plenty of smart people thought that, and they also had good ideas that we can lean on.
No, what you're doing is relating post-Enlightenment thinkers with their sources. Of course, in the history of thought, you can trace back thought up to the beginning of recorded thought. But the reality is, even if what you said is true, that those Enlightenment ideals come from Christianity, you have no basic Christianity of which to speak about as a legitimate source. So in that sense, not only is that an appeal to authority, it's also a dodging of the question. You're saying, okay, no, my ideals are not from the Enlightenment because they were inspired by people from before their time. Of course they are. They were inspired by people that lived before them, because that's how knowledge is accrued. My question to you is, why is it that your system cannot claim one essence as its own? And that's true not only for politics, but also for your own religion. You're claiming that you're an inheritor of this true tradition, yet the people who claim that they're part of that true tradition do not recognize you as their legitimate heir. So in that sense, even if you want to take the metaphysical view, what Christianity says as such is that Christ is the true heir of the true God. What he's saying is tradition, the true tradition has existed from the beginning of creation, and it was lost. Now, the idea is that Christ can trace back all of that to the beginning of time. What I'm saying to you is, just because you claim to be a descendant of those doesn't mean that you are. So my question to you is, from whence do you derive that you are the true inheritor of a tradition that is legitimate before the Enlightenment?
Okay, first, I'm not claiming to be this like magical true inheritor. That's the kind of thing an autocrat would do. I'm not doing that. You suggested I'm making an appeal to authority. Hold on. You suggested I'm making an appeal to authority. I don't know if you know what an appeal to authority is, but what I'm doing is, let me give you an analogy, right? If I come home and I have some groceries, and my wife is like, I think you got those groceries at Food City. I'm from the South. We have Food City here. And I'm like, no, I got these at Walmart. She's like, no, I think you got those from Food City. I'm like, I can show you my Walmart receipt. Okay, that's where I got it from. And she says, that's an appeal to authority. You're just saying you're right because you're showing me where you got it from. That's not how that works. Okay, it's not an appeal to authority for me to say I'm drawing from something that's different than what you're suggesting. You're accusing me of something. You're imputing Enlightenment ideas to me. I'm suggesting I'm drawing them from someplace else, and here's where, and I'll tell you where you can find it. I'm not saying I'm right because I found it in this old book. I'm just saying that's where I'm getting it against the accusation that you're making. So it's not an appeal to authority. Second, third, I don't know. You've made this claim several times, and again, this is the context of the historical claims I'm making. Again, we're here now because you've brought this up and you've made these jabs, and I'm just saying you're wrong. Like now we're into factual territory, right? Before you're just saying, well, here's autocracy, and I think it's good, and here's why, and I'm like, well, I think those are the reasons it's bad. That's just a disagreement. Now we're doing factual stuff, right? You said separation of powers is an Enlightenment ideal. That's false. We see the separation of powers in history, in the ancient world, in ancient city-states. We see it in Athens. We see it in Germanic tribes, actually. Montesquieu says we see the separation of powers into two, maybe 2.5 distinct branches, at least in the Germanic tribes. So this is all pre-Enlightenment stuff. Okay, so you're making claims that are wrong, and I'm trying to tell you you're wrong, and then you say I'm appealing to authority. That's not how it works.
No. You're conflating two very different things. The ancient world, for example, there were separations between, for example, the spiritual power and, let's say, the temporal power. For example, that doesn't mean separation of powers, though. As a doctrine.
So let me tell you again. I'll tell you the story again. So what we see in Sparta, for example, was that you had a body of elders who were affirmed or appointed by the people. They were men over 60 years of age. It's very aristocratic. I'm not saying it's a liberal democracy, but they were formed as a direct response to the oscillations between the democratic revolutions and the autocratic kings. The kings in Sparta had their power limited by a senate, and that was one of the advancements that we see in history of a separation of powers. We see further advancements of that in the English system. We see that in the Germanic tribes. There's a separation of legislative functions and enforcement functions, and then eventually we see in history a separation of the judicial functions. This is separation of powers. It's pre-Enlightenment. I don't know what to tell you. You're just wrong about it.
No, you're missing the theological point, which is, like, for example, Rome also had a senate, but the idea was that the authority, the legitimacy, came from the ruler. So when you're saying
we had Republican Rome and then we had Imperial Rome, and you're in favor of Imperial Rome, and I quite like Republican Rome. So yeah, that's the difference between us. But
let me finish, man. So what you're basically saying is that if any society somehow delegates power because a king might need a deputy, then there's separation of powers. But the reality is that what I'm criticizing is your ideology about separation of powers is what's Enlightenment coded. And that is true because even if societies before the Enlightenment had that separation of power, it didn't mean that those societies believed that separation of powers was the key, let's say, to keep their society united or flourishing. On the contrary, they would say otherwise. They would say that if you have a separation of powers, they have to respect one single unified principle, which is God above. But what you're defending is basically the American Constitution, which presupposes that they know God above, and that they, by doing different disparate things, that they can come together under this ill-defined, deist, secularized, emptied out, hollow shell of a God. And I'm telling you, that kind of God leads you to destruction. And you're saying, oh, but my institutions, and well, we're not doing enough of a good job to teach people how to respect the Constitution. And I'm telling you, Carl Schmitt was right, because constitutions are just simply pieces of paper. And the moment that people stop believing in them, they cease to exist, because someone with strong enough power will simply trample all over it, ignore it, amend it, which is what actually happened in history. You said, oh, we're talking only about speculations. I'm talking about facts. I'm talking about facts. Your own country does not respect the Constitution because it doesn't even understand what it is about. It has an identity crisis because of it. So what I'm saying is not empty speculation. What I'm saying is, if you look out the window and you look at the fact that you're at the verge of a race war over something as stupid as a jeans advertising, you cannot tell me. You cannot tell me.
You might need to log off the internet, but if you're thinking we're on the verge of a race war over the Sydney Sweeney ad, my goodness, dude.
But you are, though.
Skewed perspective.
Look at social media. Look at social media. Look at social media. The discourse, the open window has shifted. People are calling out a lot of things. There's a lot of noticing going around, man. So what I'm telling you is that
I noticed
things are heating up. Things are heating up, and it will lead to civil war if you don't find a unifying principle like any normal society would, which is actually necessary. You cannot just say, oh, we're going to worship this ill-defined God who has given us this constitution because it must have been inspired by God. Do you believe in God? Yes, we certainly believe in the same God. Let's all be friends. That life doesn't work like that. If you have different gods, you're going to go to war about it. And that's political reality. You're pretending that if we have different gods, we can all get along because ultimately we all share the same God. But your system is simply one tribe going to another, telling them, you have to pay me reparations. You have to pay me tribute because my God is on the ascendancy.
So, man, there's a lot going on there.
I got you, man.
Let's go back to the separation of powers issue, right? So first you said, no, that's not real because, yeah, there was a difference between state authority and church authority, but that's not separation of powers. But then I gave you a real example, multiple, of separation of powers, that is separation of the functions of government into distinct institutions that hold a part of what we consider to be political power, right? So we have the power to make the laws, we have the power to interpret the laws, power to enforce those. I give you historical examples of those being split up in intentional ways to limit the power of autocrats. So again, prior to the Lycurgan reforms, at least this is what Sparta taught its citizens and what we get passed down in history. You had autocratic kings and they did whatever they wanted and the people did not like that, and so they had a limitation on that. They had a body that passed the laws that limited the power of the kings, except in times of war, which is effectively what we have now. You say in the societies you're praising, God above is the unifying principle. I'm bringing up Sparta like the founding fathers of America did because Sparta is an example of a city that was unified not just by like where they were from or their particular way of life, those things mattered, but by loyalty to the law. So again, the idea that we get passed down in history, especially from Plutarch and Xenophon and others, is that Spartans were taught the law. The law was actually not written down. They were educated. They have this early form of what Christians call the law being written on their hearts, right? That the idea was, yes, this could be your unifying principle. You could have a loyalty to the city itself as it was represented in the law. And I think that's probably the best form of what we could get in America with a sort of civic education and loyalty to et cetera. We can talk about that, but again, you just went on a really long cultural rant. And again, I'm happy to admit that democracies do bad, degenerate things. But when I bring up bad, degenerate things that autocracies do, you say, well, no, it doesn't prove autocracies are bad. I agree. Doesn't prove democracies are bad just when you talk about Sydney Sweeney's genes. But you speaking of noticing things, right? There's the Carl Schmitt I was looking for, right? When I say your ideas are, I think, distinctively modern and post-Enlightenment, there's a reason Carl Schmitt is having to re-theorize politics in the context of, oh, I don't know, the rise of Nazi Germany, Yahtzee Germany, that he is not a traditionalist. He's not, well, he's a kind of conservative. You can throw him in the bucket. He's worth studying, but he is innovating. Okay. So he's doing things that you're accusing me of. Well, there's the Carl Schmitt. If you want to lean on him, that's fine. I'm not saying he's bad because of his associations. We can assess his ideas, but I'm right about where they're coming from. You've just shown me your Walmart receipt. So
no, I'm fully aware of where my ideas come from, but I'm claiming that Carl Schmitt was simply pushing back against liberalism by stating what everybody at all times knew was the case. Now, you're claiming that simply because Sparta had 2 kings and a senate and whatever, that they're doing different things under different principles. And you mentioned, oh, but they're doing it for love of the law. Very Protestant of you. I'm going to tell you that the lawgiver was actually a person they deified. They glorified the person. So they congregated around the person. They venerated that person.
And Lycurgus self-exiled to prevent that.
Let me finish.
He gave them the laws and left.
Let me finish. Let me finish. Because what you need to found a society is a common myth. And if you're saying, oh, they have separation of powers, bro, if one king did something that the other king didn't want to do, they would have civil war. And what you're saying is we have to have liberal democracy because people in the past did it and they had separation of powers. No, they didn't. They had separate powers. They had a form of formal separation of powers without the ideology of separation of powers, as the modern liberal Enlightenment thinkers said. And when I'm running out of that battery on the computer, I'm sorry, I gotta pick up the charger. But what I was going to say to you, fair enough. Okay, I trace some of my ideas back to Carl Schmitt, but Carl Schmitt is articulating what everybody everywhere at all times before modernity, before the abstraction into the ether that the Enlightenment represents did. He's saying you have an identity, a common identity, you have to protect it against the outside, and the leader is the one who makes the exceptions. He cannot be bound by rules because he's the one to make the rules. And I can give you modern examples of that. COVID restrictions. A lot of politicians, they didn't follow the COVID restrictions. Did something ever happen to them? No, because they have the power. And I'm not saying, oh, they're so bad, they're hypocrites. I'm not saying that. I'm saying rulers cannot be held down by a rule of law. And that's the problem with liberalism. You think that you can abstract things out instead of incarnating them. And I'm telling you, a strong enough politician will get fed up with this fake reality that you're creating around in order to protect your own personal sensibilities. They will take power because they're sick of the woke nonsense, and you're going to get fascism out of it. And you're going to say, oh, but fascism is modernist. I don't care. I don't care if it's fascism. I don't care if it's neo-paganism. I don't care. I'm just simply stating things as they are, not as I want them to be. And all you can do is say, oh, we're doing such a bad job educating kids, indoctrinating into our silly ideas that have never worked and don't work to this day, but we're just going to keep on trying until we get it right. And I'm saying to you, they're not right because your anthropology is wrong, because your theology is wrong, because your philosophy is contradictory. So I'm going to go look for the charger. I'm sorry. I'm going to hear you though.
That's okay.
Yeah. All right. There's a lot going on there. I don't understand how we keep ending up on this accusation that I'm just sort of like theorizing in the clouds about, how I wish things were rather than how people actually are. Because again, from my perspective, I think this is the autocrat problem, right? We're not dealing with things how they are. We're not looking at how autocracies actually work out there in the real world and how liberal democracies work out there in the real world. We're imagining some sort of ideal autocracy where if we just have the right elites, or we just have that one awesome guy in power, wouldn't it be great? I don't follow that sort of logic. And again, yeah, so I'm happy to admit of criticisms of of things that happen in democracies. I'm suggesting that democracies are better able to account for them and solve them, and that these, by the way, are issues that plague autocracies just as much, and he would have to grapple with as well. So if we're going to agree with Schmitt, for example, about some things like the friend-enemy distinction, about things like the nature of politics, and about the sovereign being the person who decides the exception, if Schmitt is right, that's just a thing that's true about politics regardless of the structure of government. That does not cleanly prove to me that we would be better off if we became autocracies. It is a recognition of fact that, yes, some people who possess political power will ignore the parchment barriers and the institutions and the people, and they'll do whatever the heck they want, and sometimes they're punished, and sometimes they're not. Sometimes their heads end up in baskets, and sometimes they have podcasts like Gavin Newsom does. That's true, right? But the same thing is true in autocracies, and I'm suggesting that regardless of what Carl Schmitt has to say about the sovereign being the one who decides the exception, I still think on a day-to-day basis liberal democracies solve for the messy problems of politics better than the autocracies do, right? The fact that there are states of exception where people or political rulers just do whatever they want and we have to deal with the consequences, us little plebs, does not form an argument for me that we just need to suck it up and deal with that, right? That's the form of government we need to embrace. Absolutely not. So yeah, no, I mean, you know, you can, I don't care if you get your ideas from Carl Schmitt. He's an interesting guy. He had good thoughts. I'm just saying, like some of the other things you're saying about, well, yeah, we just need our God kings. We just need pure power politics. Fine. This is what you're defending. That's okay. You can do it. I just leave it to the audience to decide if they like that better. Perhaps they're unpersuadable, right? Perhaps none of the arguments I'm making stick. But I would say, again, just like look at the sort of empirical examples. Again, he keeps accusing me of the sort of head in the clouds, I'm ignoring human nature thing. Which types of countries are more often successful in war? I'll give you a hint. It's liberal democracies or republics. Which types of countries have fewer famines? It's liberal democracies or republics. Which countries suffer fewer civil wars? He brought up civil war. Oh no, democracies lead to civil war. Guess what? It's dictatorships, it's autocracies, or it's failed states with young, fragile democracies that have civil wars. So yeah, I just don't see the evidence that autocracy is having all these benefits that you're describing. So yeah.
No, I think it's common knowledge now that China has already surpassed the US. That's an autocracy that already has more population than the US and is more successful. I'm not saying that it is the poster child of what I'm proposing, but what I'm saying is a success.
Is there a poster child for what you're proposing? Is there one?
Not yet. Not yet.
Oh, all right.
Not yet, but I do believe that it is through going to war and battling these things out that we get to it. I think what you're doing is basically the reason why the US is lagging, the reason why the EU is lagging, the reason why the white people are going to disappear. I think that ultimately your ideas lead to a form of pluralism that eats its own tail. So you're self-devouring right now and you're calling it progress. Yes, progress into the dirt, into nothingness, into decomposition. I kept asking you for a single unifying principle all this debate, and you haven't been able to give me one. What is liberal democracy? Because John Locke, for example, he didn't want to give people who weren't believers free speech. And you're saying, well, I'm okay with this and okay. I'm not asking you in terms of like your whimsical preferences. I'm asking you for a definition of what the true thing is. I can give you a definition for autocracy. Can you give me the ideal liberal democracy?
Wait, I'm sorry. So you're suggesting, I think your definition still is fairly abstract though, right? You're just like, well, it has to be some unifying spiritual principle. And thus far you've left that completely open. You haven't told me, well, here's the one that I think would actually work, right? So, okay, there's no poster children yet. What would your poster child look like? What is that unifying system? Is it just any given spiritual belief, right? I mean, so if you go listen to, or read rather some of Heidegger's early university lectures, for example, during, those lovely years of the 30s, he's advocating for a kind of spiritual principle and the kind of autocratic rule that you're describing. And I'm just like, is there one of these that you prefer that you're going to land on? Or is this just like, hey, as long as the autocrat gives us one, it's awesome?
I can give you one.
Sure.
That would be, I wouldn't stoop so low as to simply say, oh, I'm just a shield for what the guy up top says, because that's not in me. But what I can say is that there is a need for religion, there is a need for spirituality, and there is a need for that to be reflected in government. Besides that, I'm going to answer your question by saying
it depends on your metaphysics, and my metaphysics, at least, and I can give you that as my definition, is I think I have rejected Christianity, by the way. I'm sorry, maybe I'll go back to it sometime. But I think that God must be also present immanently. So your idea of what Christianity is a cross. It's literally a cross in the hopes of a resurrection. It is dying now, sacrificing this present life for the promise of the next. What I'm saying is more of a Nietzschean take, though I'm not a Nietzschean, is, or maybe a Hegelian, or maybe a pagan, it doesn't matter, that through these fights will eventually lead us to get closer to truth. So it doesn't matter if the singular ruler has the perfect system, as long as he's convicted of it and fighting for it, and fighting against another who wants to destroy them for having an incompatible system. And I think that through that fighting, a better system will arrive, not because I'm a bloodthirsty barbarian who just wants systems just slaughtering each other. But what I want is for you Americans to stop thinking that you're the center of the world and trying to impose your globalist empire of neoliberalism everywhere, trying to stamp out your degraded, disgusting culture and trying to destroy other cultures. So if you're saying, oh, but you're just a Duginist. No, I'm not a Duginist. I'm not a Duginist. But he has a really good point. You guys, you think that you're the saviors of the world, and you're just bombing the shit out of other countries who have just as much acclaim as you. You're just simply momentarily able to do that, but you're not going to be able to do that for long. And I have a lot of American people that I love who I want to be spared from your idiocy, because you have no problems bombing other countries in the name of democracy. You don't even have a problem attacking preemptively because of the threat of nuclear armament. You have no shame. You cannot be schooling other people into how to be ruled. You're savages. You're savages, and you will get every single thing that you deserve because you think that you are the chosen people, the shining city on the hill, and that you're going to spread this love unto the world. Guess what? You're entering into a multipolar world, and we don't want that shit, and we will fight you to the death for it. So, okay, keep talking about how democracy is so good while your own democracies are going to shit. Okay, keep selling us this system that doesn't work in reality, that has never lasted more than 300 years, while the rest of the world prospers, and you keep going down the drain. I don't want you to be going that route. But if you want to go that route, go that route. But that's the consequence of your theological and philosophical ideas. And I'm not saying this as a big me, as a bully. I don't want to tell you how to live because I want something from you. I want to tell you how to live if I can, in the small little bit that I can, for you, because that, I think, will push us closer to the moment, to the eschatological realization of humanity transcending these petty limitations. And you're saying, oh, you're just a tribalist. No. I believe that people have to have convictions. If you come here to debate, but you don't believe in your position, what are you doing? And I'm not saying that you cannot do that. I'm not saying that is illegitimate. What I'm saying is you're missing the point. You're missing the point of what that action is for. You're missing the purpose. You're missing the mark. You're trying to have a society that has nothing under which to associate itself. So what's it going to be?
Yeah, so I appreciate all of that. I think it gives me a bit more insight into some of the more fundamental stuff that's going on in the background. I'm not imputing ideas to you. I'm not doing this to poison the well or whatever. I just mean the actual differences between the ideas that we're purporting. Because you mentioned the bringing us towards an eschatological moment. That language I'm wary of because I'm skeptical of politics being something that drives us towards that eschatological moment. So yeah, I am a Christian. I believe that Christ was incarnate, died, and resurrected, and I believe that the end of history is going to be Christ coming and establishing new heavens and a new earth, a new Jerusalem. That's going to be the culmination of politics, not something that happens this side of the resurrection. So I have to reject some of the things that you're saying, and it gives me some insight, I think, into where our intellectual differences are. So I'm a really big fan of Eric Voegelin, who famously suggested suggested that the early Christian heresy of Gnosticism is sort of in the background a lot of these politics, especially what you're describing as Hegelian, that we can access some sort of secret knowledge, that we can use politics as a force to accomplish these sort of higher metaphysical ends, and that we can thus bring about an end of history, this eschatological moment. And that all scares me. So yeah, I mean, I do reject that. I think I have to as a Christian. And so, you know, I hope and pray you find your way back to the church. I'm Protestant, so I don't know if I'm allowed to say the church, but I'll say it. But I will say too that, like, this also, I think, helps me understand the appeal of some other ways of thinking to you, where I think if you go read, for example, people like Evola and Gentile and Spengler, these are people who not only, I don't care if you like these people, they're smart, they're interesting, you should read them. These are people also primarily who have rejected Christianity as a sort of democratizing egalitarian force. And so I think this is highlighting some of our actual core disagreements, which is you find something appealing in at least those ways of thinking, not any specific one for any particular reason, but just at the very least, their objections to the influence of Christianity. Like you said earlier, maybe Christianity is outworking in the world, ends in liberal democracy, and for you, I think that would be an argument against it. I think for people like Oliver O'Donovan, who I lean on more heavily, I'm going to say I think that what we can do today is take lessons learned from Christendom, the political structures that we saw there, take the political insights appropriate to Christian political theology, and actually truly have some improvement in the way we govern, the way we structure our governments, and everything that follows from that. So yeah, I mean, I think you just laid out the sort of core disagreements here in a really helpful way. You know, maybe I'm still dumb and wrong, but that's helpful. Yeah,
I completely agree with what you said. What I would add is that I think that, for example, orthodoxy is clearly in favor of monarchy, for example. Now, the thing is, Protestantism, unfortunately, has the same evident problem of Gnosticism that any neo-pagan or whatever in terms of gnoseology. So what you're saying, oh yeah, but that is not Christian, that is Gnostic. No, because the critique that people like Nietzsche make is that since you don't have direct access to Christ, since you cannot speak for Christ, whenever you decide to act in the name of Christ, you're gnostically deciding to do that. So my argument against that is that your gnoseology depends on divine revelation and your claim to know it. So for example, when you have the Protestant saying, the Spirit told me, or whatever, he's gnostically declaring himself to be an envoy of God. He's declaring himself to be an angel of God, a messenger, an apostle. So how is your system any different gnoseologically? I have nothing against Christians. What I have a problem is with Christians not realizing that you lucked out with Constantine. But Constantine, he did a lot of killing before becoming an emperor, and he only converted afterwards. Very convenient. What I'm saying to you is, you might argue, oh, Christian nationalism is so bad because they're so mean and they're not Christian. Maybe you're right, maybe you're not. I didn't come here to defend Christian nationalism. What I do think is that Christianity hasn't solved that inherent tension between mercy and rigor, and that's why you're having this intestine disputes amongst yourselves who call yourselves Christians. And I don't care if, actually, I would applaud if Christian nationalism arose, simply because it would be something with which to contend with. So let's bring it on. I mean, I have a lot of love for Christianity. The only reason why I cannot be a Christian is because I'm not humble enough, because I don't believe myself able to carry the cross as Christ would require a person like me to carry. So I admit it. Maybe I'm not a Christian because I'm weak, but I'll tell you this. Christians, in political terms, are weak by their own definition, because they have to renounce this world politically. So my question to you is, what would you do politically other than say, okay, you can come in, even though you're not from my country, even though you don't even speak my language, even though you don't have any values that accord to mine, come in, I'll welcome you in. How is that a political solution to anything and not a capitulation to the original identity that you're supposed to embody?
So I'll say I disagree. I think with the characterization that Christianity has to sort of capitulate on politics, and I disagree on this sort of characterization of the cross and the future looking hope. And I think that's articulated really well by quite a few Christians throughout history. Now, again, I didn't come here to defend Protestantism, so you can have some legitimate criticisms there. We can fight about it some other time, maybe. But I think, for example, Augustine is, I think, unfairly maligned sometimes as a kind of political pessimist, but it's not really true. There's a great book on this called Commonwealth of Hope that sort of articulates, no, actually, Augustine has some pretty great optimism about the ability of Christians and pagans to find common ground on civic virtue and the goods of the earthly city being, peace, etc. And we see this in his sermons, we see this in his letters, we see this in his teaching. It's not this all fly away kind of Christianity, well, in the sky by and by, I'm gone, so it doesn't matter. That's, I don't think, what you find historically speaking. I agree with you that there are definitely Protestant traditions that could be described as Gnostic the way you are. I'm one of the good Protestants, obviously, because I'm right about everything, or else I wouldn't believe it. And so I think we're different. But no, I think you're right. And I like Vogelin. Vogelin hated my particular branch of Protestantism for Gnostic reasons. I think he's wrong. I don't think he read enough of the stuff he was talking about. But anyways, I think... Yes, these are clear battle lines, I guess, where you're just like, okay, yeah, well, at least if the Christian nationalists got what they want, even if they're not right, even if I don't agree with them, I'd have something to fight against. I think that's where we're drawing a line. Again, like, this goes back to the violence thing. You just want to suggest I'm trying to take the sort of coward route of plushy, middling, non-martial sort of approaches to politics. But it sounds to me like you're going to the opposite extreme, and that's troubling to me. So
no, I'm not going to the opposite extreme. What I'm claiming that your position is simply wagging your finger at people and saying you shouldn't kill, and then they kill you, and then you die, and that's it. And that's the extent of what Christianity affords you politically, because the way that Christianity changes the world is by giving the example of being crucified like Christ. So when you're saying, oh no, but we can assert ourselves, what, with your wagging finger? That's not asserting yourself. That's not asserting yourself. Asserting yourself is asserting yourself. And asserting yourself means using force without shame, claiming, yeah, I'm doing it in the name of God, and I don't care, and I might be wrong, but I'm still going to do it, and I'm going to risk my soul doing it. And that's more honest than saying, oh, I might be wrong, so I have to tolerate your wrong-headed belief, even though it's destroying the lives of kids who are being neutered before they are even 18 years old.
So,
that's degenerate.
I disagree that Christians do just have to do the throw up the hands routine you're describing. I don't think there's any nothing about Christ-likeness. This is the point I do agree with the Christian nationalists on, and they might think it makes me Christian nationalist. I don't think it's true. Nothing about Christianity demands you take a politically hands-off stance and don't advocate for good policy. And so I'd say if what you're looking for is the kind of muscular assertion of Christianity into politics, then maybe you should be nicer to Protestantism, because where you get these rigorous theorists of the right to resistance, where you get people saying, here's what we're going to have our Christian state and you better deal with it, are the reformers, are the people who are like Calvin, who are just yeah, we've got our city state and it's a Christian city state, what are you going to do about it? Like Knox and all these people who are articulating, here are the grounds by which I can take up arms and resist a ruler even within the bounds of my Christian theology. So that tradition exists, and it's real. No. and it's carried into the American founding, by the way, with the Black Robe Regiment and people who explicitly leaned on their Christianity as the basis for their political resistance. So that's there you go. They're doing the gun thing. So if that's what you like, do that.
No, but you're mischaracterizing my position. I think that the problem with that, you said it yourself, they were reformers. They're not the inheritors of a tradition. They're the reformers of a tradition that they didn't like, and they thought they knew better than Christ and the church. Now, in terms of theology, I think it's very easy for me to say that if any church is the true church, it's the Orthodox Church, hands down. And I can go to war for that, but the problem is, even I was an Orthodox Christian for, I don't know, three years, very committed, very pious. Wow, very pious, whatever. So I really tried. I really tried to live it out. And what I can tell you is that if you reject the principle of gnoseology that we were talking about, that the only way that you can serve God is if God first inspires you to act, because you couldn't do it by yourself, which is also part of Protestant theology in a sense, in a different way, because the doctrines are different. But like, for example, the doctrines that the Protestants have of like complete depravity, I don't know how you call it, but like it's the same thing. It's basically you having to be cucked by God and not knowing how. Not knowing how. You don't know if you have to stand up and fight or let yourself be killed, other than your own preconceived notions or the notions of the people around you. So you're ultimately pushing the buck back into tradition or into yourself. So that is not a tight gnosiological loop. That is not an airtight epistemology. What I'm saying to you is it's not about going to war for war's sake. I'm honestly very in favor of peace, but I'm not in favor of peace based on nothing. I want peace based on real harmony and not this fake bullshit. We all believe in the same God, which is disgusting. It insults my intelligence. So I'd rather fight for the ideas that I do believe in, trying to seek out the truth like the ancient pagans did in the pursuit of truth. Hopefully, I believe there's a God. Hopefully God will see that, and the honor in which I participated, to the small degree that I could, will carry me through, and through God's mercy, I might arrive to paradise. But maybe there's no paradise. And what I'm saying is, I'm not a Gnostic for believing that maybe humanity reaches that eschatological point I was referring to, not merely by politics, but maybe through technology. The thing is, I don't give a shit about technology. I leave that to the technologists. What I do care about is for as many people to be saved, whatever, to participate in this proactive vitalist take on politics, which I believe is more aligned with the actual reality. You were talking about facts before. I'm talking about the facts of real politique. I'm talking about the facts of how I see people behaving, and this wagging your finger at people because my constitution, my rights, my this, my whatever, it all ends when somebody decides to grab a gun and say, look, dude, I'm stronger than you. You live because I let you live. Stop bugging me. And that's what's going to happen, because it always happens. So please, dudes, stop bugging us. We manly men, we are sick and tired, and we're going to start killing people if you don't stop persecuting us. I have personally lost a lot of job opportunities simply for being a white male. So you've made it, like, this liberal system has made an enemy of myself. It has made an enemy of a lot of people. And you know what? I can already see it crumble. So why are you defending this system that is crumbling? Because it cannot do what you say it does, which is keep people together. I'm saying, no, it actually doesn't. It actually alienates me. And it alienates me so hard that it's making me want to think, why should I be against my own people? Why should I fight against my own identity? Why should I fight against my own heritage? Why should I fight against my own intellectual history? Why shouldn't I simply use power and cut off the people who don't serve the interests that my people do? It happens in history, doesn't it?
So I think it's very amusing to bring up the sort of like manly men of the vitalist movement, because one of the things that's happened of late, obviously there are parts of the American right that are succeeding that I don't like, I have criticisms of, but good on overturning Roe and all this stuff that I do agree with. But I think the people who are most effective at accomplishing the things that you're describing, at fighting back against the things you feel wounded by, are the people who are best able to use the tools of liberal democracy. The vitalists and the Christian nationalists and the weirdos online who are a little bit too open about their feelings about tiny hat people, those are not the people making a difference. Those are not the people actually going out there and getting policy accomplished, right? It's the parents who show up at school board meetings who are just mad about what's happening to their kid. It's the people who are able to use the kind of outrage that's generated on Twitter and elsewhere to accomplish some sort of broader cultural movement. I don't think it's this vitalist movement you're describing. And so disputes with the Christian nationalists, I think what they want to actually achieve is actually best achieved with the tools and the power that are available to us within a liberal democratic system. It's certainly not going to be the people who are out there trying to seize power for themselves, accomplishing some sort of autocratic revolution to then somehow make it traditional again and then affect their ends. It seems to be the people who are actually able to use the policy tools available to us within a liberal democracy who are succeeding.
No, that's a non sequitur. That's a non sequitur. First of all, it betrays the fact that you don't know how politics function. You're saying, oh, these weirdos on the internet. Those weirdos on the internet are the foot soldiers. Do you think that anything could happen politically without them? That's ridiculous. That is absurd. Without the threat of force, nothing happens in politics. So those weirdos are the reason why those people who are using the mechanisms of liberalism can actually function within liberalism. Liberalism only paints a veil over violence. But if you mess with people enough, violence will emerge within liberalism itself, because voting is basically a tally of heads. It's a tally of heads who could be warriors, who could fight against each other. So we're saying, oh, we're going to tally our heads instead of literally fighting. And what I'm saying to you is, all this debate I have been repeating time and time again, you're thinking that you can simply separate the system without the spirituality. What I'm telling you is, the person who fights against these things will not be for liberalism.
I disagree. I don't know. I think we've found pretty fundamental disagreement there. And you said, like, what you mean by for liberalism, I think is interesting, right? Because what I've basically argued for here, again, I dispute with some of the characterizations, has not been like a French Enlightenment, here are the natural rights of man thing. I do believe there is such a thing derived from the tradition of Christendom of natural right, singular, that is derived from our like anthropology, who we are as human beings made in the image of God. I think there is such a thing as natural right, and the things that we can infer from that. And so I think those are the things we can ground some of our politics in. But no,
you can't.
You seem to think you'd make, I think, the same mistake that all the other. I'm very familiar with these critics of liberalism. I love them. They're fun. Go read Why Liberalism Failed and all the people Denis is drawing on. They're awesome, right? But they assume, I think you're right to say there are metaphysical questions in the background. I think they assume a Venn diagram that's actually a circle between the metaphysical claims of certain liberals and then the political structural claims of certain liberals. And I don't think they're identical, and I don't think the political structural claims require the metaphysical claims. So
they do.
I think that's our difference.
Not only do they do, but I would also like to ask you, why do you think that you can divorce ideas from actions?
I don't think you can. Didn't say that you can.
So,
I'm just saying that to find defensible things about the structure of institutional liberalism does not mean that you're buying into the philosophical anthropology and all of the underpinning metaphysics of every liberal who's ever existed and all the progressives who exist now. That's what I'm distinguishing. I think there are liberals with strong Christian foundations. There are liberals with strong moral presuppositions. These words get thrown around in these debate spaces. Well, if you're a liberal, you must be this. It's just the same thing as progressive. That's what happened with, anyways. Yeah, no, I don't think you can divorce ideas from actions. I didn't say that. So, yeah.
But performatively, you are doing that, because you're saying, okay, grant me natural rights, grant me
rights, singular, nature. Right. It's an important distinction. It is.
Grant me human nature, and I can give you the system. And I'm telling you, bro, you don't know human nature. You claim to do, except you don't, because your system clearly fails. It fails at what it's supposed to do, which is prevent war. Liberalism goes to war. Liberalism has civil wars. Does
it do it more or less than autocracies, which you're defending? The answer is less. Okay, yeah, of course liberals go to war. I'm not saying that politics has been stripped of force.
No,
obviously not.
You're pushing the goalpost, because that's on you. I never claimed that autocracy shouldn't go to war. I never claimed that.
So you're trying to make this an internal critique that doesn't land, because you say, well, they still go to war. Duh, we live in a fallen world, man. I'm a Christian. I can say that. It does it more effectively than the alternatives. That's the point that I'm making. So if you're saying the only metric I have available to me is just, does it solve the problem of violence in politics? It does it better than the system that you're proposing.
No,
and so I think so. Your internal criticism doesn't land.
It hides it. It doesn't erase violence. It just hides it and pushes it.
I'm not saying it erases violence, and I don't think it hides it either. I think it uses it appropriately when necessary.
No, it hides it. It hides it because it says you cannot think this way, or else me pretending I'm this very tolerant liberal person, I'm going to put you to jail because of your political opinions. I'm going to deny you jobs because of your political opinions. I'm going to deny you jobs because of your race. Were you a democracy before or after slavery was abolished?
Is this a serious question? Do you want me to do it?
I'm asking you, man, because what I'm saying to you is liberalism, capitalism, these systems, they don't have a good anthropology. They're just power, might makes right. In the case of democracy, it's might makes right, but with a twist, which is I'm going to say that I'm not using power, but I'm actually laying down the law in a very sneaky, dishonest way. And that's my philosophical, spiritual, ethical problem with democracy. Democracy is a system that only wants to do one thing, which is erase personal authority. Because without personal authority, what you can do is have a bunch of bankers pay the politicians, so we can always blame the system. Oh, the system is imperfect, but it's the only one that we have. It's the best one we've got. And still you've got these bankers running the country against your own identity. It's a system that guarantees treason, while autocracy, what it has in favor is that because it has a very solid identity, it kills traitors. You cannot even tell who is American and who's not. So don't tell me that, oh, my system is better. You don't have a system. It's just a mix, a mishmash of like ideas that help the people who are in power now stay in power. It's just that. It's pure power, and then the ad hoc intellectualization of that power based on a fallen spirituality, which is simply, oh, we have to be nice while we get the bad guys doing the dirty work. We pretend nothing is happening. We pretend nothing is happening when they give kids hormones and they take them away from parents because, oh, we're so liberal. We're so.
Who here is pretending nothing is happening? Are you aware, for example, of the people who are using the mechanisms of law to push back against these things, who, by the way, are being very effective, who have raised these issues, who have defended these laws on the opposite side of this in conservative states at the Supreme Court now, upheld in Tennessee, by the way, go, volunteer state, right? So the people that, like, who's saying like they're just sitting back and, oh, it's fine. It's not fine. And people are using the tools of within the liberal system to fight against it. It's not that you say that democracy erases personal authority or wants to erase personal authority. I disagree with that. It wants to make it both useful and legitimate, right? So you say, well, autocracy. Legitimate against. I don't know if you've read the Constitution, right? I don't know if you've read the Constitution, but one of the only criminal penalties that you can find in the Constitution is we killed traitors. Okay, we have a penalty for treason in our Constitution. I'm fine with using political violence to kill traitors. I just want to know who counts as a traitor before I accidentally become one in your ideal autocracy.
And you don't know, so you cannot apply it. So nobody's a traitor, except you have traitors. And you cannot root them out. And that's fundamentally your problem. And you're going to get bogged down by the traitors who are already working in your midst. What I'm asking you, and you keep dodging, is what gives you unity? What gives you an identity? What gives you a transcendent meaning for the people? Because let's be very honest, the war in Russia and Ukraine is due to geopolitical forces where the US is pushing the Ukrainians to die for their geopolitical interests. And the Ukrainians are being so naive that they're saying, oh, we want to be a liberal democracy like the West. Except they're in the sphere of influence of another country which believes in autocracy. Russia might say that they are a democracy or a democracy in the Russian style, but they're not, and they won't be. And culturally, if you go to the streets and you ask a person in the streets, like, do you mind that Putin is a dictator or whatever? They say with a nonchalant attitude, we've always had a Tsar. Russia has always had a Tsar. So, and they don't care, and they like it, and they're fine with it. But the US just has to meddle with other countries because they're not living up to the standards of liberalism. So you keep on saying how liberal you are, but if other people aren't liberal in the way that you like, you bomb the shit out of them. And that's liberalism. No, that's globalism, which is the direct descendant of liberalism, because you believe that no system is legitimate but liberalism. You believe that legitimacy. Don't interrupt me. You think that legitimacy comes from the people. And I'm telling you, legitimacy does not come from the people. That's simply one leg in a bigger table. Legitimacy comes from other sources, and one of them is spiritual. And by saying, oh, legitimacy comes from the people, you're basically saying that the table has only one leg, and it's the people. And that is a worship of man just as bad as mine.
No, it's okay. Well, specifically to that point, no, I reject that. Like the example I would lean on here, again, you can as a former Orthodox person criticize my interpretational methods here, but no, I agree with Paul, for example, that the authorities that exist are established by God. But what we see in examples like the elevation of David to king in the Old Testament is that he is established immediately by God through the ratification of the people. So he's anointed by God to be king. The people lift him up. He is not exercising the power of king until they affirm him. So it's not this weird one-legged stool thing. You keep coming back to this question of what unites you as a people. And this is what I want to hone in on. And I'm going to try to be very careful about how I say this, because I'm not intending this as like a character assassination. I think, again, this is like the fundamental key, maybe spiritual point between us. That question of what unites you, if you answer nothing, that means now you are a non-people. And the question afterwards for the people who are proposing autocracy is what happens to those sorts of people, right? So you might hear some casual references to stateless cosmopolitans. And in Heideggerian, Duginian language, stateless cosmopolitan is a euphemism for small hat people. Okay, so there's an open question that you're asking me, which is what unites you as Americans? Well, if I answer, okay, nothing actually. We've lost our spiritual center. There is no what it means to be an American anymore. Now what? Well, now an autocracy comes in and conquers us and imposes something from the top, and that's what you prefer. So I'm uncomfortable with the question as posed. I think this is a tough. I think this is a tough question that Americans have to wrestle with. We've answered in different ways over time. There's a great book called After Nationalism by Samuel Goldman. Goldman, last name, for the people who are noticing in the chat. It's a great book that looks at like the various ways we've conceptualized American identity over time, both from the founding and into the 1800s, into the period of like the Ellis Island generation. I think it is a hard question, and it's a fair question to ask. But my question back to the autocrat is, what are you going to do with these stateless cosmopolitans who have no spiritual center when you get your ideal world? And that worries me a lot.
Yeah, but the question still remains.
Sure. Sure.
The question still remains.
I'm just kidding. Like, so what? So okay. Your favored Orthodox nation has an ethnic background and has a church, and it may be a church that can ally with the state now. And then what do they do to the stateless cosmopolitans in their neighboring nation? What do you think the autocracy should do now? Because it's bad for us to go establish democracy. You think that I'm not supporting that, by the way. You keep saying you when really you mean America. If this was just an American bashing session, we'd agree on a lot more. Okay, I'm happy to bash America about some bad things it's done. Let's do it. But you are loading things in here on the autocratic side that are just like, I would like some explanation or details, right? I want some cash out here. Show me what actually follows.
Again, can you synthesize your points, please?
My synthesis is, it is a good question to ask. What unites Americans? What could we possibly appeal back to solve our current problems? And if all we wanted to do was just list all the bad things we're currently doing in policy, all the bad things we've done in the past in terms of state building and toppling regimes and stuff, happy to do that. But really what you're implying with that question of what spiritually unites you is there is such a thing as being a nation that is this like metaphysical property. And this is where I get very uncomfortable with Duginism and everything related to Heidegger. Like, so Heidegger has this famous idea of Dasein, that, the cool thing about being a human being is that we're the type of being that questions what it means to be a being. But, it turns out there's some people in the world who aren't really capable of asking that question, or at the very least are a different sort of being from me. And what we do with those people, that's a little bit of a thorny political issue. And I feel like this is getting loaded into the spiritual question you're asking of what unites Americans as Americans.
No, I think that's a non sequitur. Are you referring to like the image of God in man? Are you saying that a position that is against liberalism denies the image of God in man inherently?
I'm not saying inherently, but I think the reason why people like Spengler and Evola and Gentile and Heidegger and Dugin are at times very uncomfortable with Christianity in its traditional form is because the image of God in man has political implications they don't like.
No, it's because...
Sorry, Ivan, I apologize. I just want to let you know we got a couple more minutes and then we'll go into closing statements, gentlemen. Back to you, Ivan.
Okay, well, I wish I could have answered all of the things that Eucharist threw at me, but whatever, it doesn't matter. A very interesting debate.
We both go on long rants, okay? It's all right.
I
Left a
thought you
lot of
guys
things
were
unanswered.
fine. I thought you guys were fine. I didn't feel like anything was too long-winded. You were very clear and concise in your points, and you answered all of the questions to each other, and you asked great questions to each other. I thought it was perfectly fine.
Yeah.
Do you want to go
I
ahead and
think,
just move into closing statements, and then we can press on?
yeah, sure.
Okay. All right. Eucharist, if you'd like to kick us off then.
Yeah, I guess I'll just keep it short. I think I think towards the end here, we honed in on the things that both make me uncomfortable with what he's proposing, but also sort of put on display the differences between us, and I'm happy to be assessed on that basis, right? So I think we have fundamental, sort of irreconcilable disagreements about what politics is for, sort of what constitutes a people, how we measure success or not in a state or structure, institution of government. And I think, and I'm not trying to straw man, so he's free to tell me, tell you all that I'm completely wrong in how I'm summarizing this, but the heavy emphasis on a sort of return to competitive contestation at the level of politics that sort of unmasks the violence that's hiding in the background in liberal democracy, to me sounds very evocative of like a return to what I would call a pagan politics, or really I think of it as like a pre-politics. So one of the cool moves that you see when you study the Western tradition is like, if you go read the Iliad or something, you see like the first glimmers of real politics. You see people who are basically bound by ties of blood and kinship, who sometimes occasionally, because of contracts or hospitality or whatever, will go to war together, but those ties are loose. There's not a really strong feeling of like why Achilles should care about that guy just because he's a Greek, right? That's a sort of developing concept. And in that world, you discover what's true in a really meaningful way, primarily through violence. You get to see what God wants by the success of your people, your bloodline, your kin. And so what I have heard tonight, I think, is a politics that thinks we can find truth through real contestation and real violence, and we only get that if we sort of unmask the nasty things behind politics that we've tried to anesthetize ourselves to through liberalism. So I did take on intentionally at the beginning more, I guess, of a burden than I had to, because it was a positive claim from the start that autocracy is better. I wanted to defend democracy because I think it is defensible, but I'm skeptical that anything that's been presented is actually showing the preferability of autocracy to anyone who wasn't already convinced of those, what I would call sort of pagan presuppositions. So, maybe it's an issue that argument doesn't get us there. You just have to feel it and live it and get out of your, books and out of the clouds and go see what human nature is actually like and live at the point of a gun and everything else. But I find it unsatisfying. I have reasons that I think are drawn past the Enlightenment for supporting the kind of little R republic or limited democracy that I support. And I enjoyed the conversation. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Eucharist, and Ivan, to you.
Thank you, Eucharist, for this interesting debate. I think my position was mischaracterized many times, but not particularly in this last recapitulation. However, I would have to say that it's not because I personally want to see autocracy rise that I'm defending it. I'm defending it because I believe it to be more congruent with the human spirit and with ultimate reality. It's a metaphysical claim that I'm making. So ultimately, even if I were to grant everything that Eucharist said, I would still prefer the alternative of working out my own salvation in this life rather than gnostically presupposing that by praying or through asceticism or through joining hands with other people that we could solve the problems, or what actually Christianity teaches, that the world's problems cannot be solved, so the world has to end, and you will not be able to fight back effectively against that because the use of force is always suspect, and you're supposed to simply take it on the chin, be crucified like your Lord, and declare that you do it for love of God and neighbor. I don't think that is compatible with any kind of ancient way of living, which kind of gave a lot of credence to the importance of this world. The very idea of virtue itself has to do with the accordance of our ideas, our actions, and the world. So ironically, I'm being accused of being a Gnostic when in reality, all I want is for people's speech to match their actions. I want honesty, I want honor, I want unity, I want people to be able to truly come together, but in true unison, not fake unison, paving over truly important differences that will poison the well for everyone. I didn't get to hear Eucharist ever make a truly cogent argument for why democracy makes you whole spiritually. I only heard him try to explain why it prevents conflict. But I don't think conflict can be prevented in that way if your system isn't actually a totalizing system that can capture human nature. So that is a burden that he couldn't assume. Maybe he didn't want to assume, but ultimately you're going to have conflict whether you want it or not, because ideas play themselves out in history and people act like they believe. So thank you, Sara, for this opportunity. And I think autocracy still rules.
Way to slide that one in there. That's fair. Thank you both to you, gentlemen. I'm going to go ahead, chat. I'm going to give you an opportunity to fix yourself. I will give you open panel, even though you deserve an L right now. I will still do open panel dumpster fire for a little bit, unless you fix yourself. You know what you did. All right, so let's go ahead. We're gonna read and respond to the super chats, and then we will move on into open panel, and the chat is going to fix it for us. P. Fletch coming in with a big 10. Welcome to Saturday at the Mater Patch. Please make sure to tip your hostess and mute any annoying bastards later, and have a kick-ass stream. Thank you so kindly. Steve White is gifting out 5 Raging Tomato memberships. Congratulations to lucky lottery winners. You know what's awesome is nobody had any questions for you, either of you. This is great.
We're just not very inspiring, I think. You know, that's the problem.
I think it's an interesting concept, because I've had a conversation. We had a monarchist here one night for a Thursday throwdown. So it was quite an interesting conversation, and that open panel got pretty like Battle Dome style. So I'd be curious as to what the panel is going to end up looking like. But yes, chat, the link is pinned for you. Kokomo says, Supreme Leader Kokomo. So Ivan, sorry, I know you're getting up. How do you decide, what is the best person to lead these people? How does that decision happen?
In terms of legitimacy, I think that religion, culture, power, and class determine that. In the sense of people already, in order to live, you need metaphysical constructs, cosmologies. In order to act in the world, you have to believe something about the world. So if you do have a community, you have a community because there's a spiritual center to that community. There's at least a purpose that you're all gathered towards, that you're sharing. Even if it's something self-serving, it has to serve the community, or the community does not work. If there is something like a representative of that spirit, it will emerge naturally. So it could happen as a bubble up, but it's not because the people decided arbitrarily. It's not because people decided about ideas, or because that politician looked like they would lead them to a better outcome. It's because that politician actually embodies the spirit of the time in that sense. So, and power sometimes is, from my view, a determining factor, because you can say, oh, it's not legitimate for a foreign king to come and conquer us. Well, my question to you is, why were you so weak that you were so easily conquered? And if you were easily conquered, maybe something about your culture, about your religion, about your way of seeing the world needs to improve, and you would actually be better off if you were conquered and subsumed into another structure where the values might be culturally superior.
So is your precedence then the idea that your country can be conquered and taken over? Is that your standing point for why autocracy would be kind of the bigger, better deal?
No, but if you look at history, that happened in the US. The South was conquered by the North. So what I'm saying is, let's not pave over history. Let's not pave over real politics and say, oh, we were joined together in love because we all wanted these same ideals. No. One people imposed themselves over another people, and you can say maybe they culturally molded the other people in order to be coherent. But even if you look at something as like nice as, for example, a king converting to, for example, Christianity. The king forced Christianity upon his followers, because I highly doubt that like 100% of their followers were Christians. And I don't see anything wrong with that per se, if it's the right religion. If it's the wrong religion, yes, fight against it, but not in a, let's say, subversive kind of, oh, you're not my dad. No, you have to actually present an alternate view of reality. You cannot say I don't like this. You have to actually present an alternative in terms of metaphysics and in terms of politics.
Okay. That's fair. I was also thinking, because you said how that establishes a unity within one place, right? And you're basing it off of like either like same religion, same like belief systems. Everybody's like in the same. We're all going in this. Like we could say like all white Christian. I don't know, like what else you could define in there, but in terms of like the United States, I would look at it as, well, we have a unifying factor, but our unifying factor is the fact that we are diverse, right? Like we believe in that, and we're all pretty, I would say, Eucharist, right? We are all pretty clear on that unifying piece. Like,
yeah, I think it's again, it's like difficult over time because we've developed different notions of what that consists in. Like, so at times, like, yeah, what you're describing, like the diversity element is, especially like in the late 1800s, is like again in that book, what Samuel Goldman calls like the crucible analogy, right? That we're a melting pot, which is a weird analogy that is misused, because the melting pot analogy is literally originally like a crucible, like a forge that binds things together, not becoming this like gray soup. And so the analogy that I've heard is it's less like a sludge soup and more like a Caesar salad, right? Like all the elements kind of come together in a way that's cooperative and beneficial for all. That's the ideal, but that it's a sort of short-lived metaphor actually, and it's mid 20th century, and then with Ronald Reagan, that you get the like America is an idea kind of thing. Like it's the shining city on the hill, and it's the founding principles, and that's the sort of so I think the real answer is like a mishmash. It's like, yeah, it's part of like, you've been here for a long time. You contributed to the American project. We have this Constitution that's the bedrock of our liberty. We also think it can be changed and maybe improved in some ways. Great, we're all part of this. That brings certain duties of citizenship with it. Something I wanted to bring up, I guess, from Ivan's opening was like he said that like it's autocracy that brings this like something greater than the individual, and he might be right that it can do that, but I just think that's what citizenship does in general. Maybe we have a bad or neutered concept of citizenship, but if you have a good concept of citizenship, that brings something that calls you outside yourself. That says, as a citizen, you might be called upon to risk your life and limb for other people, for your city, your town, your state, your nation, whatever. That's what citizenship is. And so if we could find a way to inculcate that, I'd love that. And I think liberal democracies can do that. Maybe we're doing it badly. I'm happy to admit that, but yeah. Anyways.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think there's definitely flaws built into that system, right? But I still think we have the overarching unifying piece of, we are diverse, we are different, we believe in our differences, and that's what the like that welding together forgery is the fact that we bring all of these different things together. I'm sorry, Ivan, I interrupted you.
Yeah, well, in regards to what Eucharist was saying, I think the problem lies with the fact that gods go to war. If you have different gods, like, they will go to war. So the problem is not whether diversity can be allowed within a single system. The question is, what kind of diversity is enlivening of the system, and what kind of diversity is treasonous to the system. Like, even Christ says, like, if your hand leads you to sin, it's better that you cut it off. Now, the problem is, if you don't have a clear image of what that unifying principle is, you cannot even make that discernment. Because, like, you could be cutting off the healthy hand and leaving the rotten one. And, like, I get his concern, but ultimately his concern betrays a self-doubt in regards to the ability for the proper authority to make those decisions. And I think he conflates legitimacy with authority. And I think they are two different concepts. Mm-hmm. Legitimacy is multifaceted in a spiritual sense. Authority has a very tangible psychological and physical sense. Like if I'm more powerful than somebody else, not only do I have a responsibility in my view to help them if something happens, but I also have, let's say, the possibility to decide for them. And that is something that is real power. Also, for example, stuff like charisma, stuff like having an army, those things do give you authority whether or not the other person likes you or not. And legitimacy in that sense has to be different from authority, because it must be grounded in something metaphysical as well. So authority needs to be separated from legitimacy. And I see that liberalism ends up conflating them because it always prioritizes the multiple over the central. But if you prioritize the multiple over the central, not only is that an aberration in terms of theology, because it violates, let's say, the most core orthodox anthropological concepts, but it also leaves you void of a center which would unite you, which leads you to war. It doesn't mean you don't have a society at that point. You have different factions fighting for power, and that's what I was trying to like paint a picture of.
I see what you're saying. That makes sense. Kokomo also sends Ivan Drago versus Freddie Mercury. Somebody else in the chat said if you put their facial hair together, you'll get one full.
Yeah, I can't. I'm too patchy here. I can't do it. It's just the low testosterone liberal over here.
My mustache is blonder, but I do have a mustache, and I trim it a little bit shorter than the rest of the beard.
We need to color it a little so it shows up on the video.
Yeah, I look Amish, unfortunately.
do the Dagestani beard, like just
there you go. There you go. 1 over and squared sends intense as tomato. The fact that you are funded by Curtis Yarvin or some related entity is so obvious it's comical. I had to look up this person's name. Like the chat
Let's
made
get
fun
the funding.
of me. Yeah,
I wish you had that teal funding, man. You'd be doing well.
Fair enough. I'm funded by our chat, who is currently taking their big L's right now in the chat. Chat, why is the chat still saying words? They have not met their. Have they met their demands? They have not met their demands yet. L's in the chat. No, nothing else right now. Only L's. Thumping Weevil, the lady sending donos to help save all of you, says, "Hi, Sarah. I'm back. Hello, Thumping Weevil. Glad to have you back, my darling." And I believe Thumping Weevil is starting a show, or has started a show. So if you guys are interested in checking her out, please feel free, mods, to drop her channel in. Harry Ludwig sends 5 just to say, hey. Thumping Weevil also says, if I can contribute to the goal, so can all of you. Yeah, matriarchy rules tonight, while the chat takes their L's, depending on the ladies to send money. Harry Ludwig sends another 10 just to help meet the goal. Thumping Weevil sends another 10 again to meet the goal. Then she sends a whole nother 10 to say, in God we trust. Yes, we're built on religious foundation. Thank you so kindly. I think somebody corrected that in chat, saying that didn't come till the 50s, but I still think
complicated.
Like our original start-offs were around that. Eucharist here on panel sends in a big 10 to say these dollars were earned in a liberal democracy. Trib1 says Eucharist is the ultimate society ruled by a democratic republic or ruled by all who inhabit it. For top left guy, is it nature or nurture that brought us to lib democracy, and is regression positive?
I'm not sure if I'm interpreting the question correctly. It seems to be a question of like, is it ruled by the system or is it ruled by the people? And I think the reason I like the American experiment is it's trying to strike a balance, because it's like, well, technically speaking, we want, like, I think Ivan is right, by the way, that you do need to separate conceptually authority and legitimacy, but you want a government that feels legitimate, that the people are on board with, and that they feel like if I have concerns and questions, I can do something about it. But the structure itself is what gives that the coherence and sort of positive aspect that's missing from the sort of unfettered democracies where you have what these people were thinking of as just mob rule. So yeah, I might be misunderstanding the question, but I think it's like it's a both and, like the structure and the institution, the constitutional framework that sort of undergirds it. It's animating principle, and then the people give it life, and there's a heavy responsibility on the people to steward it and do it well. Yeah.
Fair enough. I'll hold the second part of the question for Ivan when he gets back. Orca with the big five, just to say, fuck all of you. A Trib1 says, for Sarah, which side do you agree with more? Not for who you think won the debate, but for your own values that works more in your opinion. I mean, I'm an American, right? We believe in the democratic structure. These are what we are raised on. This is what we follow, and this is I can understand and I can be like sympathetic to the autocracy or monarchy viewpoint. I get it. Like if we're all in the boat and we're all rowing the same direction, we're going to essentially move forward, right? And then comparatively, you would say America's in a boat and everybody's trying to steer this way and that way. You know, how are we going to get anywhere? But I don't think that that's the literal interpretation, you know, for American democracy. I don't think that that's how we necessarily operate, because we still have the same token and goal. We all have that Bill of Rights, that constitutional right that we value, and we speak this so strongly, and we believe in the power behind it. And I think that that's our driving force. Like we can all be all of these other things over and out, but our driving force is my rights. So yeah, Ivan, Trib had a question for you. Is it nature or nurture that brought us to a liberal democracy, and is regression positive?
I think that's a very silly question. I'm sorry. Like, it's clearly both, but at the same time, you're presupposing an evolution in terms of, let's say, progression from a worse system to a better system just by the framing of your question. It's like maybe you regressed, politically speaking. Maybe liberal democracy is only possible with certain technological advancements. Maybe what actually happened was completely spiritually guided by demons or angels or whatever you call them. But the question is, how legitimate is it as a political system? And we have to recognize that it's relatively new. So my question would be not if it's nature or nurture, but rather, why would you presuppose that now you have the full revelation, but when Christ came, you didn't have it? Like, that would be my question, for example, to a Protestant such as Eucharist. It's like, you'd think that something as important as a political system would have been, let's say, given to you with the incarnation of your God or something like that. In fact, if you're saying that it is either nature or nurture, you're already presupposing a materialist explanation.
Okay. Trib says, for both of you, what is the best argument against your argument you've either heard or from your own internal critique? Also, is Trump okay? I heard he got yellow hands. Yellow hands. I have no idea what that's about.
I'll start and say that I think the best articulation of an argument for autocracy, again, comes from a long time ago, the same place I think Aristotle defends what I would call democracy. He says there's some great things about rule by the one, right? That you have the sort of efficiency, the decisiveness, right? And if you have a really good leader, it all makes sense, right? There are wildly compelling reasons why we lionize and deify good kings in history. And so, yeah, I mean, like all of the things that Ivan is listing is like, well, it's efficient, it's practical, it accomplishes this. Possibly those things could be true. I think there are failings inherent to it, but if those things all obtained at the same time, awesome. Like you could have a pretty good kingship, I think. Yeah.
I think that the best argument against autocracy and in favor of democracy would be the kind of hedonism that it puts immediate pleasure in favor of self-fulfillment, or let's say eudaimonia, or what Aristotle called like the fulfillment of yourself as a person in virtue. So like if you were going to just pursue immediate pleasure, I think that democracy is better.
Okay, fair enough. Origin of Logos says to Ivan, stop talking about Gnosticism when you have no idea about Gnosticism. To Eucharist, I will convert you to Gnosticism one day. You will accept the demiurge and the pleroma. What is pleroma?
It's the unfolding into one of everything. It's a ridiculous concept. But I wanted to reply to Origin of Logos. So I'm going to take a page from Plato and I'm going to settle this small little dispute. Check out these guns, bro.
Careful. And definitely not is actually, I believe I've seen some of our work over here be reviewed on Definitely Not. So if you like to hear I'm pretty sure this is what I've been seeing. If I'm wrong, Definitely Not, please correct me in chat. But I believe Definitely Not reviews the debates and provides commentary on it. So if you like to hear the commentary post debates, please feel free to go subscribe to Definitely Not. I've seen some of our stuff over there, at least. And New Guy says saving the chat. You had to be saved. I'm very disappointed. You still take your L for the evening, and you've got a lot of earning to do. Yeah, you've used clips from here. Fair enough. All right. Panel, to you two, I'd like to go ahead and open the panel. Is everybody good to go? Ready to rock and roll?
I'm ready.
All right, let's have some fun. All right, you all have been here before. You know my rules. I don't have to repeat myself, but I will say if I am reading a super chat, please be mindful because those are precious tokens this evening. The chat is failing horribly. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to kick off the gauntlet, and maybe we just get a little refresher. Everybody in the chat can feel a little refreshed in a new chat. And maybe we'll kind of spice it up a little. And so I'll kick off the gauntlet here in just a second, and we'll raid over there in a few minutes. All right, Ryan, you were first in line back there. What you got for us, darling?
Yeah, my question is a little bit tangential. Ivan mentioned at one point that he was convinced that he lost out on jobs for being a white man. And I'm just curious, how did you figure out that you lost those jobs for being a white man and not just for being an insufferable prick?
Dude, why should I reply to you? You're just a bitch.
You don't have to. I'm just curious. Okay, so you don't have so you have no reason to believe that you lost those jobs for being a white man, so you're probably just lying about that.
Are you just here to shoot shots at folks?
I was gonna say.
Maybe I am.
Well, we can let's open that topic, okay? In terms of we don't have to go into Ivan's personal life on it, but let's open the topic to the idea: does autocracy prevent that from happening? Because essentially, we're going to have all of the same people with the same beliefs and the same backgrounds and the same color skin and whatever going on. I'm guessing, or we won't have to worry about DEI because of that. Does autocracy prevent stuff like that from happening?
I don't think so. Do you, Ivan?
I didn't hear the question. I'm sorry.
I opened the topic, does autocracy protect the citizens from dealing with like DEI issues and things of that nature? Because everyone essentially has the same religion, the same color skin, the same background, the same influence, the same philosophy or belief system, so on and so forth.
It's a good question. I would be tempted to say that it doesn't inherently, but fundamentally, I would say that you would want to do that anyway if you have an autocracy. So
what if we get an autocracy where our autocrat at the top is one of these feminists who comes on these debate panels, and her spiritual imposition on the autocratic state is the divine feminine? Okay, right? We get the Lavaloon of the world who did, you know, like that sounds, you know, maybe we just get reverse DEI from your autocracy. Is that
it will be a short rule. I mean, my argument is not my preference of what I want.
No, I know.
Ultimately, it's. I think that if you're misaligned with reality, you're gonna get pushback from that.
That actually happened with like a lot of monarchs during like the Enlightenment, where they were hyper liberal, but their like population was mostly conservative and reactionary, where they tried to push reforms, but they got pushed back. So much so that some of them had to be deposed and their children had to replace them. So, yeah, it's funny how that works. People go and rebel because they want you to be intolerant when the ruler is tolerant. I think that happened to the king who was beheaded, and then Cromwell was the regent.
But doesn't the
the people that you're not
base off of the individual?
Sorry, go ahead, Coxsquatch.
But doesn't each autocracy base off the individual in command? I mean, king down, whatever. Wouldn't very much like the Stalin-esque purges of yore be something that would take place in that type of a environment?
Yeah.
No, that presupposes individualism.
Individualism is a thing, sir.
No, it's not.
You're not an individual?
That's a very low IQ take. Sorry, bro.
Sasquatch. I'd say like I would say like something that's more important than the personality or the skill of the monarch is the aristocracy behind them. Like if you look at something like China, that's more absolute power. Whereas if you look at like England, where they tend to have like a bunch of shit kings that ended up having the nobles take more and more power, then you would see that it doesn't really matter what the monarch does. It just matters what the parliament wants.
Okay, but we're speaking of autocracy, which sort of bypasses the parliamentary procedure. We're talking a top-down structure where an individual, right, a person, a single autarch has command? Or am I completely misreading this word?
I think
the argument he's presenting suggests that autarch could occasionally be held accountable, whether that's to the sort of shifting sands and estimations of history, or to the people who could uprise against them. And I think what you see in the history of like the development of English common law is exactly maybe what he's expecting, which is part of why I think it's good. But that you end up with an autocrat that people don't like, and then whether it's the nobles or the people, there's going to be some sort of exercise of physical force, like we're going to sit you down and make you sign the Magna Carta that places some restrictions on what you can do with our freaking property, right? So yeah, I just view it as like an inevitable decline of autocracy.
Magna Carta, by the way, in the 1200s, far before the Enlightenment.
Yes, a little bit before.
That kind of brings up a point that Ivan mentioned earlier about legitimacy, and you said that we're confusing, or Eucharist was maybe confusing the legitimacy of the autocrat with something else. Wouldn't autocracy denote legitimacy? Wouldn't that be a thing? Like, you can't get rid of autocracy because that's the legitimate king. That's the ruler. You follow his rules.
Speaking of a mandate from heaven?
No, you can overthrow them.
Am I off on that, Ivan?
It's not self-referential. It's not self-referential. To answer to part of what Eucharist was saying about my position, he was correct. But the other part of it was that actually people didn't think of themselves as individuals until pretty late into intellectual history. The concept of person and the concept of individual are different. in Orthodox theology, for example, there is a big strain of thought that goes against individualism as a concept, because it presupposes that people are not collectively joined together and interpenetrating themselves, spiritually speaking. So, for example, even if you look at the Bible, even the first books, like the book of Genesis, you have the concept of, for example, you will separate from your parents to marry, right? And the problem there is that if you live with your parents, for example, you're sharing in their same spirit. When you cleave off from your parents and you become one flesh with your woman, now you're sharing the same spirit with your woman. So the idea wasn't that you're this closed off individual, that you're basically able to monarchically like deflect any influence from outside you that you don't like. It's like you're gonna be tainted by it whether you want it or not, simply by being in touch with it. So to answer to Coxsquatch first question, like, I don't believe we're individuals. I believe we're persons, and personhood implies a mysterious dimension, which is I don't even know how much of a person I am, because I don't have access to the total interiority that is going on in my personhood, and I cannot fundamentally block each other, like other people, out of my ways of thinking, etc. And to answer to Clay, so I think if you take that idea of personhood, that already implies that not only can you not be self-referential, but you're forced to interact with other people, and that conditions you even if you don't want it. So it's not that autocracy means, oh, I'm God above everybody else. That's one form of autocracy that clearly didn't last in history. I would say it would be much more useful to think of autocracy as the person whose authority we follow because they're closer, let's say, to the spiritual reality we're supposed to inhabit. So some societies had that as a priest king, some societies had it as a god king, some societies had as an anointed king. And basically that's the idea. It's not that, oh, I am God. It's okay, God speaks to me in particular. Like take Prophet Moses, for example. Like Prophet Moses had a particular relationship with God that the people of Israel didn't. And the whole question that Moses poses God is, God, you're going to come down to us, that will obliterate us. So please let's give me more mediation, because this will turn out bad for the people of Israel, right? And that's ideally within that frame what makes Moses a good person, because Moses is actually performing the role of a priest within that community, but he's also the political leader of that community.
So my follow-up to it would be something to the cultish nature of organizations, religions, political affiliations, things like that. How would it be that I would or should put my trust in other men who claim autocracy?
You can't. There is no justification for that. It either takes trust, coercion, or a combination of those two.
Do you believe in free will?
And before you answer that, to the chat, if you're watching on the tomato side, we are moving to the gauntlet now. I'm shutting down the tomato side. So please feel free to either catch the raid or make your way over through the link that I dropped in the chat. Thank you so kindly to you.